Okay. Welcome, everyone, to our first session this morning. My name is Siamak Moemi. I'm a professor at Columbia University, and I will be the session chair for the session. The topic of the session is measuring decentralization. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Andreas Fabrega from Cornell University, and he will tell us about voting block entropy. Please.
Cool, thanks. Check. Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us so early this morning. So today I'm going to be talking to you all about decentralization in DAOs and some of the challenges in understanding and measuring decentralization and our approach at this problem. So as we're all aware, DAOs are sort of everywhere in the blockchain ecosystem and come in many different forms and have multiple different use cases. So you have DAOs that manage DeFi protocols for lending, operate as community-run investment funds, support gaming guilds, jointly purchase and collect iconic NFTs, and even DAOs that attempt to buy copies of the US Constitution. And on top of this all, we have even more sort of bizarre and niche DAOs like communities for people named Dave. So even though DAOs have very different purposes, size, rules, and even sort of degrees of seriousness, they all share this common self-evident ideal of decentralization as a goal that they all strive towards and as something that's important for their community and for how the DAO runs. So decentralization is this thing that we sort of have an intrinsic understanding of what it means and why it's important, but there is really a gap in a robust academic understanding and study of this property. So we sort of this normative notion that we all care about and understand why it's important, but what does it really mean and how can we increase decentralization? And a proper understanding of decentralization in DAOs is really, of course, an important problem. So decentralization is this kind of axiomatic ideal that the community strive for, and there's, of course, a number of important questions we could ask about decentralization, such as how can we monitor the quote-unquote health of DAOs with respect to decentralization? How can we design voting mechanisms aimed at increasing decentralization? Is there a correlation between parameters of the DAO, such as treasury size and decentralization, or even like what is the right level of decentralization? Of course, too little is not good, but probably too much is also not good either. So before we can even ask these very important questions about decentralization and think of ways of improving or optimizing decentralization, there's this key first step of determining what's the right way to measure decentralization in the first place. Like what really is the definition of decentralization in some sense? And this is, of course, a necessary precondition to understanding and formally studying decentralization, since we need to know that we're studying the right thing to begin with and that we're optimizing for sort of the right metric. So prior work has, of course, sought to define and measure decentralization, and most approaches roughly have a similar flavor, which at a very high level of abstraction consists of computing some function over the distribution of tokens across accounts. So this function that's computed tries to ask roughly how evenly distributed tokens are across individual accounts. And this may be, for example, Shannon entropy or Gini coefficient or Nakamoto index. And this is sort of what's used as the proxy for decentralization. And while a good first step, this approach is insensitive to a few important things that may happen in a DAO, which really affect its quote-unquote true degree of decentralization. So for example, it may seem like the DAO, the tokens are fairly well distributed across accounts, maybe even perfectly evenly distributed, but in fact, most of these accounts are actually owned by a single entity, so the DAO is actually not that decentralized. Or again, the DAO may seem to be pretty decentralized, but most voters don't even care about what's happening in the DAO and don't even vote. So really power is concentrated amongst the few whales, or I should say the few voters that are actually casting votes. Or the DAO may once again look to be very decentralized, but most voters are paid to vote a certain way, and really there's this sort of like large conceptual whale voting according to what the briber indicates. And there's kind of more examples of sort of these forces that are really centralizing voters to vote in certain ways, which are not apparent in distribution of tokens. For example, another interesting one is social pressure, where voters may feel influenced to vote a certain way, which is really having a centralizing effect without altering distribution of tokens. And yes, we can see from these examples, while voting power may seem to be well distributed, token holders may be sort of acting in harmony as these single big abstract voting entities. So this raises kind of the motivating question for this work, which is, what is a kind of mathematical way, what is a way to account for these centralizing forces, and how can we capture the, let's say, true degree of decentralization in a DAO? So this last question is kind of the starting point of this work. So in today's talk, I'm going to present our attempt at approaching this question by introducing a new metric for decentralization. And I'm going to discuss how we arrive at this metric and how can we derive both theoretical tools to formally reason about decentralization and prove results about decentralization, and then also deriving practical instruments to empirically investigate decentralization in DAOs. So that's sort of the game plan for the rest of the talk. So our new metric is called voting block entropy, pronounced VIBE. And as we're going to see, VIBE is an attempt at a kind of first principles approach to decentralization. And it's aimed at capturing these intuitive notions of decentralization that are not reflected in token distributions, and kind of to capture the informal notions of decentralization that we as a community believe matter for decentralization. And more concretely, the aforementioned examples, how can we have a metric that is cognizant to those kind of subtle examples of centralization? So VIBE is actually quite simple, and it's based on one foundational principle, which is that instead of thinking about decentralization in terms of individual accounts, we should be thinking about it, as I've kind of teased throughout the talk so far, in terms of aligned voters. That is, we need to measure decentralization really in terms of the abstract voting entities that are actually driving the voting and decision-making process. So concretely, we should be reasoning about the distribution of tokens across these abstract so-called voting blocks that I'll define later, and thus capture these like sort of centralizing forces. And we formalize this notion of aligned voters, or voters with aligned interests or incentives in terms of aligned utility functions. So of course, as many of you know, utility functions are kind of the mathematical representation of interests and alignment, or I should say just interest for voting outcomes. So we can think through alignment of interest through alignment of utility functions. And if you think about it, the centralizing forces I mentioned earlier all kind of conceptually do the same thing at a very abstract level, which is to align utility functions that are otherwise kind of pointing in different directions towards common outcomes. So for example, in the case of whales, we could think of it as all the accounts under the control of the whale as having the same utility function, namely the whales, of course. Bribery as taking sort of utility functions pointing in different directions towards a single outcome, namely the briber's preferred outcome. Similarly, social pressure, the utility functions are now aligned towards the socially preferred outcome. And this is kind of the pattern we'll see throughout the rest of the talk of thinking of different things affecting decentralization as affecting incentives and alignment of utility functions. And I kind of want to take a moment to say that this is what I consider the main really conceptual contribution of the work, this sort of mental model of decentralization as alignment of utility functions. So to be more concrete, computing VIBE is a simple two-step approach. First is this clustering step, where we partition the set of voters into so-called blocks, which is a term used in the voting literature, or cliques of aligned voters. So here each slit would be the utility functions or their aligned interest or their interests. And this first clustering step creates these blocks according to the similarity of those interests. And then this is followed by computing as before, some function over the distribution of tokens, but now over the blocks of aligned voters. So again, this could be Gini coefficient, entropy, so on and so forth. And of course, this is a general recipe that can be instantiated with any suitable clustering and entropy metrics. So Vibe is in fact a framework, or I guess more accurately, a family of metrics. And a priori, the only kind of requirements on the two steps is that, of course, the clustering must actually cluster utility functions. So it must specify a partition on the set of voters, and specifying some equivalence relation. And then the entropy metric is just some function over the resulting equivalence classes and their total token holdings. So again, this is kind of the basic two-step approach to computing Vibe, which is kind of the first step based on this insight, I guess, of alignment in terms of utility functions, and then the standard ways we compute. We think of decentralization in terms of like entropy or some function alike. So having introduced Vibe, now for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about how we can actually use this metric, as I said earlier, both in theory and in practice, and kind of hoping that this motivates future work on either of these two directions. Before I do that, though, probably many of you are wondering, utility functions are what we call latent variables, which means that we can neither compute them directly nor even know directly ourselves, like what's our own utility function for a voting outcome. Like, what does it even mean to have a certain monetary utility for the outcome of an election? We cannot measure utility functions directly, so of course we cannot measure at this point Vibe directly. So what even is the point of all of this? Like, why am I wasting your time? So this is for two reasons. First, even at this level of abstraction of utility functions, as of course we know from economics, we can derive theoretical results, and we can use Vibe as a theoretical tool to reason about how certain policy choices directionally impact decentralization. So we can formally prove results and reason about how policy choices may impact decentralization and thus derive practical guidance. And then the second prong is that we can use, as all latent variables, we can estimate them via so-called observable variables. So using observable on-chain data, we can estimate utility functions and therefore compute Vibe on this observable data that I'll talk more about later and get a close enough estimation of Vibe. And there we can actually compute useful stuff and, as we'll see later, do sort of like measurement studies and so on to derive practical insights. So this is going to be, I'm going to talk about both of these, first theory, then practice, and then we'll wrap up the talk. Yeah, so as I said, Vibe is this theoretical tool to think about the directional impact of policy choices. And kind of the intuition is that proving results about policy choices on decentralization kind of boils down to thinking about how said policy choice affects the utility, the alignment of utility functions. So is a particular policy choice creating new voting blocks, or is it breaking up existing voting blocks into smaller ones, therefore increasing or decreasing decentralization respectively? And this general pattern that I just said, we kind of capture it formally in the paper in terms of what we call the Vibe master theorem. But for here, I'm just going to talk intuitively about kind of give a flavor of a few of the results we show, the intuition of a few of the results we show. So as a first example, let's talk about delegation. So intuitively, one might expect that delegation increases centralization, since most people are handing their voting power to someone else, and those delegates become sort of larger and larger whales. So individual accounts now hold more tokens. However, when looking at it through the lens of Vibe, what may be actually happening is that they're coming from, in fact, a bigger whale, a bigger voting block, which is what we call this inactivity whale. So we have a bunch of small accounts that are functionally acting as one entity due to their aligned utility functions, namely not caring about the result of the election. So delegation may be breaking up this voting block into smaller voting blocks, namely the delegates. So the lesson here is that delegation may in fact be a good thing for decentralization when there's a lot of apathetic voters. Of course, if we have a very active DAO where we don't have many apathetic voters, then delegation may increase centralization. The second example is with regards to voter privacy. So what does voter privacy have to do with decentralization? So there's this well-known problem in voting that social scientists call herding. And what this means is that voters tend to vote in similar ways as their peers or as highly reputable people. This may be because they are perhaps lazy and they just want to copy what more informed people are doing, or maybe there's social pressure to vote a certain way due to what their actual vote may say about themselves, I guess. And for example, there's this, on a recent paper by Sharma et al., where it's sort of a survey paper on DAO dynamics, voters reported that the way they voted was influenced by trying to avoid reputational damage. So this voter said, I didn't want to vote against the proposal just because my reputation would be on the line or something. So the fact that people need to worry about their reputation through the lens of vibe causes voter alignment and therefore lowers vibe. So the public nature of votes, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is aligning the utility functions of players towards a socially preferred outcome. And the lesson here is that ballot privacy may help increase decentralization, and conversely, public ballots may increase centralization. So by allowing voters to vote according to their true preferences, we can think of private ballots as kind of breaking up this social whale that arises from wanting to vote for the socially preferred outcome. And the third and last example I'll talk about concerns bribery of voters. So I think from the prior two examples, you can probably tell what's coming, which is that bribery increases centralization by making voters vote according to what the briber instructs them to do. And we show this in the paper, but in fact we show a second and more interesting result, which is that this sort of, I don't want to say surprising, but at least to me, counterintuitive notion that the more decentralized a DAO is, the risk of systemic bribery also increases. So the more your DAO is decentralized, the more that the risk of kind of coordinated, automated bribery also increases. And the intuition behind this is that the higher decentralization, so the higher vibe, the outcome of elections depend on more ballots. So if you want to manipulate the outcome of the election, you need kind of widespread coordination mechanisms as opposed to kind of big whales cutting backroom deals, let's say. And this is sort of a realistic threat via what we call dark DAOs, or what is known as dark DAOs, that are thankfully not a short-term threat, ironically because DAOs are not very decentralized today, but we see it as a long-term threat and kind of important mitigations, an important problem to think about mitigations. And if you want to hear more about dark DAOs, I'd encourage you to attend the liquefaction talk later in the conference by a few of the authors of this work, where we talk about kind of the underlying mechanisms behind dark DAOs, which are these coordination mechanisms for vote buying. So I'd highly encourage attending that talk. So these are three examples of the flavor of results we show in the paper, and we have the formal derivation of the results capturing the intuition I just mentioned in the paper, and deriving practical guidance, and showing how proving results even through the abstraction of utility functions is useful to think about what could increase or decrease directionally decentralization. So I'd encourage you to look at the paper and this helpful chart we have there with general guidance. Great, so now we're going to switch gears in the last 5 minutes or so to actually using Vibe in practice, using Vibe in the wild. So as I said earlier, utility functions are latent variables, which means they cannot be measured or even known by us, I guess. But like other latent variables, we can estimate utility functions via observable variables, so observable on-chain data that reveals information about the true value of utility functions. So this brings us to what we call observable vibe, or OVibe, which boils down to representing utility functions based on observable on-chain data, and then computing Vibe, clustering voters in Vibe based on this representation of utilities instead. So we obtain an estimate of the true Vibe in the system based on this information that reveals stuff about the true value of utility functions. And of course, the most natural example of observable data that says something about utility functions is voting history. So the history of votes reveals the direction of utility functions, so the ordinal utilities, which we can use to get a pretty good estimate, a pretty good handle on true utilities and derive useful results, both for this work and more generally, of course. So kind of going back to our vibe diagram from earlier here, now the slits would be vectors of votes instead of abstract utility functions. Maybe this voter voted yes, no, yes, I'm missing a comma, but yes, comma, abstain, and no. And we have similar vectors of votes in the circle, and then we can now actually compute some clustering function over this data. This is kind of the general recipe. And as a more concrete example, we can have a data set of observable data that's maybe a matrix where every row is a 1, 0, or -1 representing the votes for the prior elections. And then now on this actual data, we can compute a clustering function and an entropy metric. Maybe we use, I don't know, hierarchical clustering or something else, Hamming distance, et cetera. And then maybe mean entropy, and we obtain like actual vibe numbers. So this is kind of as I said earlier, the observable estimate of this vibe abstraction that I introduced earlier. So with that, I'm running a little bit of time, so I'll pick it up. But equipped with OVibe, the first step we did is to think of a way to empirically, now that we have like an actual metric, how can we empirically estimate whether this is in the right direction towards thinking about decentralization? So what would empirically validating a decentralization metric look like? Sort of taking a step back. So it would be something like the following. So we would have a set of voters that have some interest in the outcomes of elections, and then we have some way that induces agreement between voters artificially, and then we just compare the resulting decentralization in both sets of voters, in the same set of voters, and we would hope that decentralization would decrease in the second group. This is the most natural example you could think of to validate a metric. And as it turns out, there's a natural example of such an experiment already happening in the wild. So many DAOs employ sort of what we call two-round voting protocols, which is that they first do a temperature check where they kind of vibe check the community on a potential proposal, agree on parameters, engage in discourse, and so on, followed by the actual voting round, where the proposal is either accepted or rejected. And here what's happening is that the first round is designed to form consensus, form agreement, and this is really kind of artificially inducing a form of centralization, at least through the lens of vibe. So what we can do is to compare the vibe in all round 1 votes and all round 2 votes, and we would hope that vibe would decrease by this artificial way of inducing centralization. And we performed such an experiment in Uniswap. We picked Uniswap for a couple different reasons. The most important one, and I'll go quickly for the sake of time, is that, at least in our opinion, the off-chain temperature checks are quite explicitly designed to signal community sentiment and form agreement for the second round of voting. And indeed, as we expect, we found that OVibe consistently showed lower, OVibe was consistently lower in the second round, about a 15% decrease, whereas prior metrics don't show a decrease from one round to the next, obviously normalizing for token fluctuations and so on. And then now that we have some, of course, this is just a heuristic evidence of vibe as a good decentralization metric, not a complete proof, but equipped with this, we now move to doing more useful stuff with OVibe in the paper. So what can you do with OVibe? The most obvious thing is to monitor decentralization in DAO. So by continuously tracking decentralization, we can hope to increase decentralization, think of interventions, try to detect attacks, and so on. So we performed a large-scale measurement study of 34 DAOs. Our particular framework instantiation was k-means with Euclidean distance. Then we used min and Shannon entropy. And this was computed on a rolling basis of 10 proposals over basically from all data we could gather from 2020 to 2024, October 2024. And we make the results public if you look at the paper, we have a public dashboard with the results of our measurement study and also computing decentralization according to other metrics like Gini coefficient and Gini coefficient, Shannon entropy, and so on. And as expected, vibe is consistently lower than other metrics, showing that it's sort of capturing more information. And I say this is expected because you could think of like kind of vanilla, let's say, Shannon entropy as a particular instantiation of Vibe, namely where clustering is singleton sets. And we, in this paper, this is sort of descriptive. We're just showing the results and leave comprehensive analysis for future work and thinking about what were their spikes, what were their drops, and so on. And here I'm highlighting 3 examples. So Arbitrum was the one with the highest Vibe according to our study. And we see a couple different stories told by these 3 plots. So first, like Arbitrum has pretty high Vibe, but also high standard deviation, which suggests that it's possibly a decentralized DAO that at times has high agreement between its members, maybe because some proposals are pretty benign, like agreeing on obvious parameters and so on, or like security patches, etc. Balancer has low Vibe and low standard deviation, which gives evidence of just low decentralization, and then Lido is sort of somewhere in between those two with average Vibe, but also high standard deviation. And we can see that even DAOs that have high decentralization go through periods of low decentralization, a bunch of proposals that everyone just kind of agrees. And I don't recall exactly what these proposals are, but you know, this is showing that every DAO has at times stuff that's like obviously benign that everyone's voting in favor of. And the last thing I'll talk about, this is the last thing, I promise. The last thing I'll talk about is that you can use Vibe to improve DAO design. So you can use it as a signal metric in governance experiments. So we can compare the Vibe of a test group versus a control group with a particular intervention. Maybe the second group has private ballots, and in that way we can understand concretely how Vibe increases, or private ballots in this example, increase or decrease decentralization. And in the paper, we talk a little bit more about a collaboration with Optimism doing precisely this, a Vibe-based experiment. And to wrap up, just three more bullets, I promise. I'm almost done, sorry. Some direction for future work. So this work was very descriptive in the second half, so thinking a little bit more about how we can analyze this data and use it to derive kind of like real-time interventions and so on. Vibe is more useful within the history of a DAO than across DAOs. It's where it mostly shines, just because DAOs vary so much from one to another. So thinking of ways to normalize a little bit more across DAOs. And lastly, how do we even instantiate Vibe? Like, we use k-means, but why did we do that as opposed to like hierarchical clustering? You know, understanding that in a principled way, it's like an important question. And now that's all I had for you. Also, feel free to send me emails with questions. Yeah.
Turn up the. Okay, so maybe just a couple quick questions. Maybe I'll start. So in my mind, Vibe is measuring utility alignment, which I interpret as agreement or disagreement. That seems different to me than decentralization, which is more about, does any agent have significant power? So maybe that's the first part of the question. How do you relate those two? And maybe the second part of the question is, to the extent that we think decentralization is good, and Vibe is a good metric to measure that, that would suggest designing systems where people disagree. And that sort of seems different to me than like sort of traditional notions of optimality, for example, social welfare. So for example, if we all had the same utility, maybe social welfare would be very high and we would all be happy, but our Vibe measure would be very low, which would suggest it's bad. So I'm curious how you think about those 2 points.
Yeah, so for the first question, if I recall correctly, was about, you think decentralization is more about like an individual entity?
Individual power, rather than...
So I think it's not too far apart from the way we're claiming it should be looked at. It's just, we think so-called individual entities having a lot of power should really be thought about individual groups having a lot of power. So it's sort of the same notion, just one level of abstraction above it.
But you're just measuring agreement, not power, right?
We're measuring power across groups with high agreement, I guess is the way to harmonize those two. And to your second question, yeah, this is an excellent question. And in some sense, Vibe is just measuring decentralization, not claiming decentralization high or low is a good thing or a bad thing. And what's the optimal level of decentralization, Vibe, whatever you want to call it, is sort of a very important question for future work. But out of scope, but very important one. It's a great point.
Thank you. Okay, maybe you want to go ahead and set up the next talk. We have time for maybe one more question while the next speaker sets up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the contribution. I had basically the same questions as CMAC. I want to go deeper a little bit on the first, which is colloquially, if we think, I wonder how your example gets applied to Ethereum, which seems very decentralized, at least colloquially. but then is also characterized by strong consensus, both in terms of block production and validation, where everyone agrees, typically, that the blocks are valid, or in hard fork development, where all the clients agree to do the same thing. So it seems like if we applied Vibe to those scenarios, we would observe a lack of decentralization because everyone agrees on the same thing. But colloquially, I certainly think of Ethereum as very decentralized. So I wonder if you could.
Yeah, it's a great question. Just briefly, and we can chat more about it offline since I don't want to take time from the next talk. I think that Vibe should be understood really as mostly a DAO-specific metric, and it's hard to overlap it to other parts of the Web3 ecosystem just because it's purposely trying to understand intuitive notions of decentralization for DAOs, which may not be the same as those for other parts of the Web3 ecosystem. Because I agree with you that even ignoring Vibe for a second, like what I claim to be like intuitive notions of decentralization for DAOs, maybe not necessarily overlap to other parts of Web3, which may require other metrics. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again. Okay, our second speaker of the session is Christina Ovezik from the University of Edinburgh, and she's going to speak about measuring blockchain decentralization.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. My name is Christina Ovezik, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. Today, I'm going to talk to you about our paper on measuring blockchain decentralization, or our approach to it, which is joint work with Dimitris Karakostas, Mary Milad, Daniel Woods, and Angelos Keyas. So before I go into the specifics of our work, I want to motivate our research problem a bit. Why is this something important to study? So let's have a think about what it means for a system to be centralized or decentralized. In a centralized setting, there is a single point of control, which also means that there is a single point of failure if things go wrong. So if the entity that has full control over the system gets compromised, then this will compromise desirable system properties. For example, we can have censorship or data loss. However, in a decentralized system, there is no entity that has full control of the system. Instead, control is spread across a number of independent entities, and there is no single point of failure. So blockchain systems are generally designed with decentralization as an objective. However, decentralization is not a binary property that the system has or lacks, but rather it operates on a spectrum. And the degree to which a blockchain system is decentralized impacts its security, fairness, and even legal status. For example, if a blockchain is not sufficiently decentralized, then it might be susceptible to a majority attack. Or if some authorities deem that a blockchain is not sufficiently decentralized, then they may classify its underlying token as a security, changing the legal framework in which it operates. So for someone who wants to assess these properties of a system, the question arises of how to determine its degree of decentralization. For one thing, blockchains are multi-layered systems. Each of these layers is characterized by a distribution of resources across relevant parties that control these resources. And when I talk about a resource here, I refer to the unit of power or influence whose ownership distribution would affect desirable system properties such as safety or liveness. For example, if we think of proof-of-work blockchains, hash rate could be a resource of interest there, and if some entity controls more than 50% of the total hash rate, then it poses a threat to the system's safety. So then the question becomes how to identify the right resource, how to extract the resources distribution from the available data, and how to quantify decentralization given this distribution. Now, in this talk, I'll focus primarily on two layers. In general, the work of identifying the different layers that are relevant to blockchain decentralization has already received some attention, including a paper that I presented last year at FC. But now I'm not going to talk about all those different layers. Instead, I'll focus on the consensus and tokenomics layers. But a lot of the insights I'm going to share with you can also extend to other layers. Now, one of the reasons for focusing on these two layers is that there is a larger body of work dedicated to their measurement. However, even though there are some studies that attempt to measure decentralization in the consensus and tokenomics layers, there is no unified approach to doing so, and the decisions that are often made during the measurement process, such as how to pre-process the data or which metrics to use, are often arbitrary or lack justification. So let me explain a bit about the two layers that we're focusing on. When I talk about the consensus layer, I refer to the way the blockchain gets extended, which happens through the creation of new blocks. The creator of a block gets to decide which transactions get included in the block and in what order, and they also get rewarded with system tokens for their contributions. Therefore, the more blocks that one can create, the bigger the influence that they can have in the system. Then the tokenomics layer describes the economy associated with the blockchain. Every blockchain has a native token that is typically used for on-chain transactions, and tokens are issued when blocks are created, and then they're traded on secondary markets. Again, we can tell that the more tokens one can control, the more influence they can have in the system. Now, I'm going to talk about the contributions of our paper. So we first developed a framework with the different steps that need to be followed when measuring the decentralization of these layers, and we systematized the existing literature with respect to these steps. Then we conducted an empirical analysis to determine how sensitive the results are to the different choices that are made during the process. And finally, we used the insights from our analysis to derive recommendations for future studies. Now, on a high level, and as I briefly touched upon before, we distilled the measurement process into 3 questions. First, what is the relevant resource associated with the layer in question, whose ownership distribution can influence the properties of the system? Second, how can we extract the resources distribution from the available data? And last, which metrics should we apply to this distribution to get a good estimate of its decentralization? Now, in a bit more detail, we propose this 7-step workflow that captures all choices that need to be made during such a decentralization measurement on the consensus or tokenomics layers. First, we need to choose what resource to focus on, and therefore which data to collect. Then we perform clustering to get a representative distribution of resources to the entities that control them instead of individual blockchain addresses, for example. And when the resource distribution is not directly available, we need to estimate it using a proxy distribution, and in a similar manner, estimate the population of active participants. Then we sample the data enough times to capture trends. We potentially apply thresholds to denoise the distribution. And finally, we calculate metrics on these distributions to quantify the overall decentralization. So first, let me show you how the existing literature fits on the framework that I described. We analyzed 20 prior studies that focus on the consensus or tokenomics layer, measuring their decentralization. And we classified those based on the steps that I explained before. And one thing that I want you to take away from here is that there is no consistent approach to any of these steps. We can see, for example, that even though various clustering methods have been proposed, there is a big chunk of these works that don't perform any sort of clustering before analyzing the results. Another example is the different thresholds that have been applied in the literature, many of which seem rather arbitrary, like focusing on the top 10 or top 50 entities. Now, another thing that I want you to take away from this talk is that these steps actually matter quite a lot, and that these choices, these different choices that we can make. So making an arbitrary choice there can lead to greatly overestimating or underestimating decentralization. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through over our analysis for each of the steps that I described, but you're of course welcome to read our paper if you're interested or ask me questions later. I will give you an example though. I want to show this graph that shows the historical Gini coefficient of Bitcoin's block production. Now you can see that all like these different lines that I have there, each of them paints a very different picture. So there are some lines that show Gini coefficient being quite low, indicating equality among the block producers, while there are others that make the Gini coefficient seem very high, indicating extreme inequality, and therefore centralization. Now, crucially, the only difference when calculating these results is how we defined the population of active participants for a certain time period, meaning whether we look at participants that produce blocks only during that time period, or whether we also looked backwards and forwards to account for unsuccessful miners that were still active during that time. So I could, in theory, present to you just one of those lines and say, oh, this is the Gini coefficient of Bitcoin block production, but obviously, depending on the choice I make there, it will show a very different picture. So what we're advocating for is not making arbitrary choices, but making informed choices and also being explicit about them. Now, moving on, I want to dedicate a bit of time on the topic of decentralization metrics specifically. After all the pre-processing that I described has taken place, a metric is then responsible for assigning a value that represents the decentralization of a distribution. Now, a wide range of metrics have been proposed for evaluating blockchain decentralization. They have been used in the literature. Typically, these are borrowed from fields like economics or information theory, but sometimes they're also crafted specifically for blockchain systems, like the Nakamoto coefficient, for example. Now, each of these metrics has its strengths and its weaknesses, and they typically focus on a particular part of a distribution, such as the head or the tail. I'm not going to explain all the metrics, but again, feel free to ask me later if you're interested in a particular one. But now, looking at all the different metrics that have been used, we ask the question, do all these metrics actually capture the same signal of decentralization or not? And to answer this question, we employed a statistical tool called exploratory factor analysis that analyzes the observed variables, in this case, the results of the metrics, to infer latent variables or factors that capture the data in a more succinct manner. Now, we ran this analysis on historical block production data of 3 proof-of-work and 3 proof-of-stake systems, and calculated 7 different metrics for each system. To help with the interpretation of the results, basically the number of factors that we see represents the number of distinct signals that are captured by the metrics, and if a metric loads highly onto one factor, then it means that it largely captures the corresponding signal. So these are the results of the factor analysis for the decentralization metrics on the consensus layer. We can clearly see that there are 2 camps here. we see that 3 of those systems have a single dominant factor, so we conclude that they capture the same latent signal, which we assume to be decentralization itself, while the other 3 systems all exhibit 2 factors. And an interesting observation we can make there is that 3 of those systems, though, are proof-of-work systems, while the other 3 are proof-of-stake systems. And if we look at it a bit more, we can see that in the case of proof-of-work systems, the metric that counts the number of participants consistently loads onto the second factor. It loads onto a separate factor from most other metrics. And this allows us to speculate that proof-of-work blockchains are perhaps not as successful at translating participation into decentralization as their proof-of-stake counterparts, or that also more generally, participation is not always a good proxy for decentralization. Now, as a summary of our paper's contributions, we proposed a decentralization measurement workflow. We demonstrated that methodological choices, such as whether to cluster addresses controlled by the same entity, or how many blocks to use in order to infer mining power, can largely affect decentralization estimates. We provided recommendations for future measurement studies, and we also had this interesting finding that in proof-of-work systems, participation signal seems to be decoupled from decentralization. Now, I want to use the remainder of my time to talk to you a bit about an ongoing project that we have at the Blockchain Lab at Edinburgh that basically implements the workflow that are described and our methodology for measuring blockchain decentralization. This is the Edinburgh Decentralization Index, or EDI, that aims to be a public resource for monitoring the decentralization of blockchain systems. All our repositories are open source, and we've published an interactive dashboard that compares the decentralization of different systems across multiple layers and using various metrics. We believe that measuring decentralization is quite a challenging endeavor, but one that should always be addressed transparently and in a reproducible manner. We think that auditing the decentralization of blockchain systems is the collective responsibility of our community, and figuring out how to do it is up to us and not, for example, regulators that want to decide on their own system for defining what's decentralized or not. So we are trying to offer the tools that we have to coordinate these efforts, and we're making a call to the community to join us in this mission. And I also want to highlight that we are currently preparing a survey that aims to understand how people in the space perceive the notion of decentralization. Because sometimes we all talk about decentralization, but it's not clear if we're talking about the same thing. So we're designing a survey now that aims to understand how the community understands decentralization. For now, I've included this QR code that will just take you to a Google form that asks for your email in case you want to be notified of this survey. It would be amazing if you could do that, if you would like to share your opinion with us, and in the future we will follow up with the survey. I also want to mention that as part of our efforts to foster transparency and accessibility, the Edinburgh Decentralization Index leverages the Edinburgh International Data Facility, or EIDF, which is a high-powered analytics and storage service built and managed by the University of Edinburgh's Supercomputing Centre. Now, all EDI data will eventually be publicly archived at EIDF, allowing everyone to access them and reproduce our results. Now, since I mentioned our dashboard, I also want to take you on a quick tour of it. and show you that we already have 5 different layers that we have results for, and we're working at the same time on adding more blockchains, more systems on the layers that we already have, while also adding support for more layers. And this is an example page from our consensus layer, where we can see how 8 different systems compare on multiple metrics. Here I've shown the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, or HHI, and the Nakamoto coefficient. And recently, we also added this graph to the dashboard that aims to give an overview of blockchain decentralization across the different layers that we analyze. And we call it the decentralization compass because we hope that it will help us navigate the different layers of blockchain decentralization and help us get quick insights on how what is the landscape, what is the current landscape. Thank you very much for your attention. I think there's time, so I'm happy to take questions, either now or, of course, later. And again, I encourage you to scan the QR code and participate in our survey in the future. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions.
Sure. So about 4 years ago, in the Decentralized Society paper, which I co-authored, we introduced the notion of clustering and measuring decentralization through these methods, which has motivated a lot of this work. And so my critique is actually both for this talk and the previous talk, which is that you're basically looking at one side of power here. If we're talking about decentralizing power, it's not just about control and outputs, it's also about information and inputs. So if you focus exclusively on observed behavior, right, there are some set of participants who control enough resources and information to influence the information of those subset of participants to achieve outcomes in voting to their advantage. And it's because you're just looking at one side of that equation and not just looking at control to the detriment of ignoring information that I think these measures of decentralization are inherently flawed and will actually empower participants who do have power and make them more powerful and entrench existing power structures.
Sorry, I didn't exactly understand what you're proposing that should be measured instead.
So what I think needs to be also measured, right, is taking a broader view of communication and looking at the set of affiliations and groups to whom we communicate with, right, and acknowledging the correlation in information amongst the set and the clustering of information amongst a set of participants, not just on their outputs. There are two sides to the equation here. And that's just ignored both in this talk and the previous talk, right? So like, let me give you an example. Like, so back to like first principles, like what is power? And I'm saying power is both information and control. State-controlled media is an example of that, right? The more control you have over media, the more you control information, the more control. It's a flywheel, right? Mm-hmm. The same sort of logic applies here. So if you're just looking at outputs and you're just looking at control, right, to the detriment of like, well, what's the information influencing these participants, then there's some subset of participants who already are powerful who can influence information and change votes on the margin to manufacture decentralization to their advantage, right?
Right. I think the reason why we're focusing on the observed data, observed distributions, is that these are the ones we can measure.
Yeah, and so what I'm suggesting is like a future area of research is trying to represent groups and affiliations to capture this other side of the power equation and the information problem, because these are game theoretic information problems. Just looking at control will open yourself up to gaming.
Right. I mean, we also, one of the layers that we're currently working on is the governance layer, which basically aims to understand how decisions are made in the system, which is a bit more nuanced than the layers I described now. So on the governance layer, where there is on-chain governance, we can get some data from voting and so on. But especially for those that only rely on off-chain governance, there is a lot of analysis that needs to be made exactly about what you're saying, how is information propagated in these networks and who decides?
Even in on-chain voting, so I've written a few papers on this, even in on-chain voting, you can have participants that off-chain collude, right?
Right,
So-
of course.
And that's an information problem.
Of course, yeah. So even the systems that employ on-chain voting, on-chain governance, they always have an off-chain component, which we aim to analyze as well. But of course, it's more challenging because there's the question of where do we get the data for this, and there is no ground truth
Yeah.
to compare this data to.
We can talk after. I have some
Yeah.
suggestions on that.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, go ahead. Next question.
Yeah, I was wondering, maybe I missed this in your talk, but isn't there a very qualitative difference between proof of work and proof of stake when looking at decentralization? Because in proof of stake, you need 2/3 of, well, let's just say for something like Tendermint, for example, but most proof of stake is very similar. You need like 2/3 of existing validators to approve any new validator by not censoring their staking transaction. Whereas in proof of work protocols, anybody can come in who wants to spend the hash power or other forms of work. So isn't that an important qualitative difference which wouldn't necessarily be captured by looking at the distribution of resources within a proof of work or proof of stake protocol? That the proof of work is like permissionless in a way that proof of stake isn't?
Well, I think both of them are permissionless, but I think what you're referring to is the different barriers to entry that they have. And exactly because different systems will have different properties or different thresholds that would break their security guarantees or any desirable properties, such as censorship resistance. That's why we have different metrics that look on different parts of the distribution. So for example, the Nakamoto coefficient makes a lot of sense for a system like Bitcoin, but it wouldn't make equal sense for a system that requires a larger number of participants, like 66% of participants to do it.
But isn't there there's no level of hash power which could permanently censor a proof of work system? Unlike proof of stake, where if you have 1/3 of the staking token, you could lock out any other participants permanently.
Right, but even in proof of work, you're saying you can't do it permanently, but you can do it, and then there's the question of whether the system will recover from it. But we still consider it a problem if such an attack can be launched. But surely different systems will have different properties that we care about or different thresholds, and that's also part of the reason why we use different metrics, and one of them is not sufficient to capture everything.
Okay, if there are no other questions, let's thank both speakers. We will adjourn right now for the break and reconvene in 30 minutes for the session on the Ethereum blob market.
I do a little public service announcement. This is my noise-making device for the lightning talk session later, which you're all very much invited to come to and give talks. It's 3 minutes talks, pretty strict because after that, I do this until the next speaker starts, basically. You can bring your slides. You can do it without slides. You can do it ad hoc. You can do it about research results, about research work in progress. You can do it about your startup or just about whatever idea comes to your mind. The way we're going to run this is basically first come, first serve. So, if towards the end of this session, you can just come to the stage, basically queue up there, and then we'll just take turns. And you can plug in your laptop, show your slides, and yeah, the mic is yours then for three minutes. So yeah, get your slides ready and see you later.
Yeah, and just a note that these impromptu talks will start at 11:30, right after this session. Yeah, so the next session is about blobs in Ethereum. Blobs are very important for Ethereum. In fact, they are kind of like core to like one of the 3 pillars that like the Ethereum ecosystem and core devs are working on, like scaling the L1, scaling the L2, and improve UX. So in the last few forks, there have been like first like launching blobs and then like increasing the number of blobs, and then in the next one with pure DAS will also like increase by order of magnitude. So the topic is obviously very important, and we'll have 2 talks. Like the first one, it's more theoretical, like new construction from data availability sampling, And the second one is more practical, but so Aditi will be the first speaker.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Aditi. Thank you for the introduction. And today I'll be presenting our work on data availability sampling with repair. This is joint work with Dan Bonnet at Stanford University and Joachim Noy and Valeria Nikolenko at A16Z Crypto. So let's start with consensus, as it forms the core part of all blockchains. Here we have a bunch of validators, and on the left we have a pool of transactions coming in from the network. With consensus, the validators output an ordering all these transactions, and then the execution layer of the blockchain can take this order and go and execute these transactions. But the problem is, as we try to scale to more and more transactions from the network, the consensus layer quickly becomes the bottleneck, because all consensus protocols have at least a quadratic amount of overhead. Because of this issue, there is a need to be designing scalable consensus protocols which allow us to scale to high throughput blockchains. One technique that has been very commonly used to scale consensus has been to decouple the ordering of transactions from dissemination. Let's see what I mean by that. So again, we have a bunch of validators here, and we have a pool of transactions coming in from the network. But now the key change that happens is, instead of running consensus on the transactions, we will now be running it on just references to these transactions. So here, the file clip on each transaction represents a reference. From cryptographic standpoint, you can think of it as a commitment to the transaction. So yeah, for consensus, the validators will only see the references. But in parallel, the validators will run a separate service, which is called verifiable distributed storage. And these transactions from the network will be dispersed on the storage service to be stored. Now, during consensus, as I just mentioned, the validators will only see these paper clips, which are the references. And before they vote on these transactions, they will just go and verify with the storage service that the actual transactions are indeed being stored. Eventually, we will get an ordering on the references as the output from the consensus layer. And then the execution engine will look at these ordered references. And for each of the reference, it can go and retrieve the actual transaction from this storage service. So this is a high-level overview of this technique of verifiable distributed storage, which has been foundational in scaling consensus. So let's dive a little bit deeper. So this primitive of verifiable distributed storage is essentially a storage system where you can verifiably store a large amount of data among storage nodes, so that every single node has to communicate and store only a small part of the data. So let's see a picture. So here we have a bunch of storage nodes, and these are essentially the validators that we saw in the last picture. Then on the left, we have someone called disperser. So you can think of this as the block builder who's collecting all the transactions into a block. The disperser will get as input a large set of transactions, which I'm denoting by one big file here. Then the first thing that happens in a verifiable distributed storage system is that the disperser will run the protocol called disperse, wherein each storage node ends up with one small part of the data. And I'll be referring to these parts as chunks. And it also outputs a public reference, which is the paperclip at the bottom. Next, we have verifiers, which are actually the validators from the previous picture. They can go and talk to these storage nodes and run this verify protocol to check whether the chunks are actually being stored in the system. Eventually, in the future, if somebody wants to actually get back this whole data, we call them the retriever, they can run the retrieve protocol, ask for chunks, and get back the data. So this is a very high-level abstraction of this thing called verifiable distributed storage. But in practice, we see two incarnations of this, and you might have also heard of these ones. The first one is verifiable information dispersal, or VID. So you might have heard of AVID, which is asynchronous VID, or ACID. But essentially, at a high level, it is a verifiable distributed storage system where verification is being done non-interactively. So specifically, during dispersal, each storage node, the moment it gets its chunk, it also publishes a signature certifying that it got the chunk. Then to verify this system, the verifier just looks at the signatures, and it outputs one if enough of them are valid. This is actually being implemented in practice as well by EigenDA and Espresso data availability systems. The second incarnation of verifiable distributed storage is data availability sampling, or DAS, and this is going to be the focus of today's talk. At a very, very high level, the verification happens interactively. So here, the verifier will sample random chunks of the data, and it will go and query the nodes for those chunks, and it will output one only if it is able to find all of those chunks on the network. So this is a high-level overview. I will be going into more details later. And this is actually being used in Celestia networks, and Ethereum is also planning to implement this in their Fulu fork coming up early 2026, I think. So just generally speaking, VID is better for permission systems where you have a small number of validators, whereas DAS can actually help you scale to even large numbers of validators in a permissionless setting. So as I briefly said before, today's talk will be focused on data availability sampling, but all of our techniques and insights also apply to VID. Okay, so with that, let's get started with our work. The key question that we ask is, how do you repair lost chunks? So in this diagram, what happens if the last node loses the chunk of data that it was supposed to store? What's worse is that the disperser could be malicious, and maybe it never disperses the chunk that the last node was supposed to store. Now, the reason why this is not good for our system is, recall that the verifiers and the retrievers are going to query these nodes for their chunks. But now, if the last node does not have the chunk that it's supposed to, then all the verifiers and retrievers will have to talk to the first 3 storage nodes, which can create bottlenecks on the network. Moreover, if any of these 3 storage nodes now lose their chunk, we might just lose the data forever. So because of this issue, these issues, there is this requirement that we should have some way to repair the chunks that you might have lost. With this motivation in mind, in our work, we make 3 key contributions. The first one is that we give new definitions for data availability sampling. So here we are generalizing the definitions from prior work by Hall and Essen 2023, and we formalize the notion of repair, which says that if a node in this system loses its chunk, there should be an efficient way to repair it. Secondly, we actually also formalize the notion of retrieval, where we say that in the future, if somebody wants to actually retrieve the data, they should be able to do so. Secondly, we actually present a new framework for constructing DAS with repair from 2 building blocks. The first one is codes with locality, plus the second is erasure code commitments with locality. And I will be explaining what these are later in the talk. And the third is that we give a new construction of DAS with repair, where we use this framework, and we initialize it with multiplicity codes, plus a new polynomial commitment scheme. So I will be going over all these things in detail, but before I do that, I just want to mention that this commitment scheme might actually be of independent interest. For example, you can use it for verifiable secret sharing or private information retrieval. Okay, so I will be focusing on constructions for the rest of the talk, but just in terms of definition, I just want to show that this is a repair protocol where if, let's say, the last node loses its chunk, it can just talk to a few other nodes and repair the chunk. For the rest of the security definitions, you can look at our paper. Okay, so now let's move on to our construction. So here I'm going to compare our construction with the Ethereum's proposed scheme in their Fulu fork. And all of the numbers I'm going to show will be for one blob in Ethereum, which is 128 kilobytes. So starting with node storage, this means how much data does each single node in the system have to store. In other words, this is the size of a single chunk of the data. So for Ethereum, each node has to store almost 8 kilobytes of data, whereas in our construction, it's just about 0.2 kilobytes. So we have 35 times lower amount of storage for every single node in the system. Next, in terms of repair complexity, to compare how good is the repair, we have 2 metrics. The first one is the total amount of bandwidth you have to use over the network to repair one lost chunk. For Ethereum, this is 128 kilobytes, whereas for our scheme, this is almost 21 kilobytes. So this is 6 times lower amount of bandwidth over the network to repair a chunk. The second metric we define to compare repair is this thing called number of subnets. So for this, I'm assuming that we are in a peer-to-peer gossip network model where you have a separate subnet or a topic for every chunk. So this is like a particular network model, which is actually what Ethereum is planning to use for their DAS scheme. So in terms of the number of subnets you would need to join to repair one chunk, for Ethereum, this is 64. It is slightly larger for our scheme, but this isn't really, we believe this is a very reasonable trade-off. So next, we have a few other metrics. The first one is sampling bandwidth. So this means for every single verifier in the system, how much bandwidth do they have to use to have some assurance that the data is actually there. So for Ethereum, as per their specifications, this is about 16.4 kilobytes. But for our scheme, this is almost around 9 kilobytes. So this is almost 1.8 times lower bandwidth usage for every single verifier in the system. And I do have an asterisk on Ethereum. This is because they actually achieve a lower level of security than our scheme, in spite of using more bandwidth. Oh, sure. Sorry about that. Next, we have disperser work. This captures how much work does the disperser or the block builder have to do to be able to disperse this data. So for Ethereum, this is about 0.3 seconds as per their implementation. And we also have an implementation of our scheme. And we observe that if the disperser has enough number of cores, for our scheme, it will just be around 0.42 seconds. So this is 1.4 times more work for the disperser, but we believe this is a reasonable trade-off to be able to achieve efficient repair. One last metric is the number of subnets for dispersal. This means how many total subnets you need to disperse all the chunks. So Ethereum has 128. We do have 9,000. but I want to show you this screenshot from the FAQs of Ethereum's Fulu specifications, where they claim that the number of subnets does not matter. But just in case it does matter, and I believe it does matter, we have this technique called batching, which allows us to reduce the number of subnets down to around 1,000, which is much more reasonable for the network of Ethereum. And we still preserve at least 2 times better performance on all other metrics. In today's talk, I will be focusing on the main construction, and you can look at our paper for the batching technique to reduce the number of subnets. All right, so for our construction, let's start with the building blocks at a high level. The first building block is a new framework for building DAS with repair from a code with locality plus an erasure code commitment with locality. And the second is we apply this framework to multiplicity code plus a new multivariate polynomial commitment. So let's get started with the first building block, which is the framework. So I'm going to start with an existing framework for DAS, which has been used in Ethereum, for example, and has also been formalized in the prior works. So here I have a bunch of storage nodes, and I have a block or data, which is 5 blue blobs at the top. So the first thing we do to disperse this data is we encode it with an erasure code. So here the encoding is E, with E1 being the first symbol, then we have E2, and so on till En. And then the first node just stores the first symbol, which is E1. The second node stores the symbol E2, and so on. Next, to verify, because we are in the sampling construction, the verifier just samples random positions of the encoding. So for example, it samples position 1, and it gets back E1 prime. It can sample position 3, it gets back E3 prime, and so on. So this is a very high-level structure of how you can construct data availability sampling. But one thing that's missing here is how can the verifier actually check that the symbol E1 prime is indeed correct with respect to the data. So for this, at a high level, we need some sort of commitment to the data so that I can check these symbols with respect to that. So prior works actually formally define this with the notion of erasure code commitment. So here you can commit to data with respect to a code C, such that you can open the commitment at any position of the encoding. And this is exactly what we want in our DAS scheme. A bit more formally, you would have a setup algorithm, and then you would have a commit algorithm, which gives you the commitment com to any data. Then you have the open algorithm, where for any position I of the encoding, you can get a proof pi I that can let you prove a symbol for that position. And then lastly, we have the verify algorithm, where you can check whether the symbol EI for position I is actually valid using the proof from the open algorithm. So yeah, I won't be talking about like the correctness and the binding properties of this commitment scheme, and you can look at a paper for that. Okay, so with the commitment scheme in hand, this is the full framework for DAS, the existing framework. So as before, we are encoding the data using an erasure code, and then we commit to it using an erasure code commitment to get a commitment com. And the paperclip represents that this is the reference to the data. Now, one more thing that the disperser will have to do is to compute the openings of all the positions. So it gets proof pi 1, which is the proof for symbol 1, pi 2, which is the proof for symbol 2, and so on. And then the first node will get the symbol E1 and the corresponding proof pi 1, and so on for all nodes. Verification remains the same as before. The verifier queries random positions, but now it will also get back the proofs for every position. So now it can just check with respect to the commitment scheme, and it will output 1 only if the proof for all the positions are actually valid with respect to the commitment. So this completes the high-level overview of the existing framework. And to summarize, if you encode the data with an erasure code and you commit to it using a commitment, you get a secure DAS scheme. As an example, if you look at the Ethereum's proposed scheme in their Fulu hard fork, they are using a Reed-Solomon code to encode the data and the KZT polynomial commitment as the commitment, and that leads to their Fulu DAS scheme. But now the question in our work is, how do you repair lost chunks in this framework? So let's say the last node loses its data, so then the question is, how do I repair the symbol En and the proof pi n? So for this, the key observation we make in our work is that we should be using codes with locality. Specifically, we should be using locally correctable codes, where you can repair a single position of the encoding by querying only a few other positions. So let's see an example. Here we have the encoding, and let's say we lose symbol En. Then if this is a locally correctable code, then we can actually compute this En from, let's say, 2 symbols, in this example, symbols E1 and E5. This is in contrast to any regular code where you would actually have to use the whole data to compute that one lost symbol. So with this locally correctable code, in our new framework for DAS, other things remain essentially the same, but the key thing is that the disperser will now be encoding the data using a locally correctable code. Verification remains the same as before. So now, if let's say the last node loses its chunk, it can just query the nodes 1 and 5, get the symbols E1 and E5, and now it will be able to repair the symbol En that it lost. But now we still have one problem. This node was also storing the proof pi. How do we repair that? So for that, we observe that even the commitment scheme needs to have some notion of local correction or repair. Bit more formally, you should be able to repair the opening proof for any position of the encoding by querying only a few other positions, querying proofs of only a few other positions. So here I have the diagram from before where the encoding has some notion of local repair. Now what we're saying is that the commitment as well must have a similar notion. So let's say you lose the proof pi n, then it should be possible to compute this proof from the proofs pi 1 and pi 5, which correspond to symbols 1 and 5. So with this, now we're ready to see the full DAS framework from our work. As before, we are encoding the data using a locally correctable code. But now we also commit to it using an erasure code commitment with local correction. And now again, you have a commitment com. Verification remains the same as before, and we also have opening proofs for all positions. And now, if this last node loses its chunk, which has the symbol En and the proof pi n, it can simply query nodes 1 and 5, and now it has enough information to repair its chunk. So this was a very high-level overview of a framework. You can find details in the paper. But to summarize, if you encode the data with a locally correctable code, and if you have a commitment scheme, which is an erasure code commitment with local correction, you would get a secure DAS scheme with repair. You can find the formal proofs in our paper, but one thing I want to mention briefly is that we also formalize the use of a peer-to-peer gossip network for dispersal, where there's like different subnets for different chunks, and this actually becomes sort of crucial in one of our analysis. You can find the details in the paper. Okay, so now we've seen the framework, and we know that we need a locally correctable code plus an erasure code commitment with local correction. But the question is, what type of code should we be using for this framework? For that, let's look at the efficiency metrics that we care about and we saw before. So first, we have node storage. So as per our framework, each storage node has one symbol of the encoding plus one opening proof for the commitment scheme. So this means that if you want small node storage, we should be using commitment schemes which have short opening proofs. Next, in terms of disperser work, the disperser has to do the encoding for the code, plus it has to compute the opening proofs for all positions. So now again, if we want an efficient DAS scheme with efficient disperser work, our code should have efficient encoding, and the commitment should have an efficient way of computing all opening proofs. Similarly, for repair complexity, this directly depends on how efficient is the local correction for your code and commitment. And lastly, for sampling bandwidth, we prove in our paper that this directly depends on the minimum distance of your code. So you should be using codes which have good minimum distance. So keeping all these metrics in mind, in our work, we use multiplicity codes to instantiate this framework. And now let's see what multiplicity codes are and why they are a good choice for DAS. Okay, so multiplicity codes were formally introduced by Kopati et al. In 2014. You can think of them as a generalization of Reed-Solomon codes. So I'll be giving some technical details here. Okay, so you can interpret the data as a multivariate polynomial of some degree d. So here I'm taking the example of a bivariate polynomial. So the data is equal to f of x, y. Now the encoding of this data contains three things. The first is that it has the evaluation of the polynomial f at all points x, y in a set S. So this is looking like Reed-Solomon if you're familiar with that. But the key thing that's different about multiplicity codes and that gives it these extra special properties is that it also has derivatives of the polynomial. So we have here f prime x, which is the first derivative with respect to x, and f prime y, which is the first derivative with respect to y. And now the encoding contains the evaluations of these derivatives as well at all points x, y. So I'll just show a figure for more intuition. So in multiplicity code, let's say you were encoding the polynomial f. The first symbol of your encoding, which is E1, will contain the evaluation of the polynomial f at the point 1, 1, but it will also have the evaluation of the derivatives f prime x and f prime y at the same point 1, 1. So these three things together make up one symbol of the encoding, and this is what the first storage node will be storing. Similarly, we have the symbol E2, which is just the evaluation at the point 1, 2, and so on till 1, q, and this is what the nodes will be storing. So essentially, we can complete the whole matrix. We have the evaluations at points 2, 1, 2, 2, and so on till q, q. So this is the encoding in the multiplicity code. But the two key properties which I want to highlight are first, that it has good distance. And just at a high level, the reason is that the derivatives that we are storing, like this f prime x and f prime y, this is essentially extra information about the polynomial. So this has more redundancy in some sense, and this allows us to achieve good distance. And this is important for achieving good sampling bandwidth for our DAS construction. The second key property which I want to briefly show is that it also has good local correction, which gives us good repair. So let's take an example. Let's say you lose the symbol EQ of your encoding. So now let's focus on the first row of this encoding. We have the evaluation of f at 1, 1, 1, 2, and so on till 1, q. So you can think of these evaluations as a polynomial, univariate polynomial, f of 1, y. And now this polynomial also has degree d, which is the same as the degree of the overall polynomial f. So what this means in one line is that if you have any d+1 symbols in this row of the encoding, that's actually enough to repair the symbol that we lost. And you can essentially do this for the derivatives as well. So this is like a high-level overview of why multiplicity codes have good local correction. And one last thing I want to highlight is that you can do this repair along any line. So let's say you have the diagonal. Again, if you have d+1 points on this line, you can still repair the point. And similarly, you can also do this on a column of the encoding. So yeah, you can find details in the paper. This was just a high-level overview. Okay, so now the last part of our construction is that we also need a commitment scheme, which works well with the multiplicity code. So we need to be able to open to derivatives, and we need batch opening algorithms, and so on. So because of that, we have proposed a new multivariate polynomial commitment scheme, which allows us to do exactly all those things. So just very briefly, this is a new polynomial commitment scheme, which for the first time achieves the following 3 features. First, the opening proofs for the first, we can do opening proofs for evaluations of the multivariate polynomial and its derivatives. And this is important because our multiplicity code has derivatives as well. And just in high level, we use the PST commitment from 2013 as the basis, and we generalize that to achieve this. And as an example, if you're working with bivariate polynomials and just the first derivatives, then the proof size for a commitment scheme is just 3 group elements, and verification is just 4 pairings. The second key feature is that we have an efficient algorithm to compute the opening proofs at all positions. So if you recall, this is important for the disperser because it has to compute all openings. And for this, we actually generalize techniques from Kovrot-Ovik-Feist to multivariate polynomials and the derivatives. And lastly, we also have an efficient way of locally correcting opening proofs, and this is important for our construction to achieve local repair. And in the interest of time, I won't be able to show you the scheme itself, and you can find that in the paper. To conclude, hopefully I've convinced you today that repair in data availability sampling is an important problem. And in our work, we have new definitions to formalize repair, and we have a new framework that you can use to build new DAS with repair schemes. And lastly, we have a new construction of DAS with repair from multiplicity codes plus a new commitment scheme. So here's the link to the paper, and thank you. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Aditi. Any questions?
I just have a question. I think what you're using effectively for the local correction is also being used in Reed-Muller code. So how do you compare using
also has been used where?
in Reed-Muller code?
Yes, good. Okay, so the thing that, so multiplicity codes are essentially a generalization of Reed-Muller codes, and the reason why multiplicity codes are better because they have better distance. So it's actually been proven like theoretically that multiplicity codes are sort of one of the best codes which give you good local correction plus good distance. And the distance is important for the sampling bandwidth, that's why.
I see, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Nice talk. From which assumptions can you build the new polynomial commitment schemes? Do you have a hash-based construction?
Good, okay. So our commitment scheme is PST, so essentially the same assumptions as KZG. But that's a good question. Maybe in the future we can have hash-based commitments which have like no setup. So that would be a good open question, yeah.
Do you see any direct challenges to generalize FRIDA or like IOPP-based constructions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the key problem is because we have these derivatives in our encoding, like the moment you encode the polynomial with FRI, let's say, you're sort of losing the structure of the polynomial. So then it's unclear how can you prove openings of derivatives. Yeah, but that's a good open question.
Yeah, so can you give a bit of intuition about why the subnets explode and like how does the subnet relate with the sampling exactly?
Oh, I see, I see. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so the number of subnets essentially depends on exactly how you're encoding the data. So for us, what we do is we just take the data and we have this long encoding with multiplicity cores where you have derivatives and stuff. And the reason why the number of subnets is large because I'm in our scheme for simplicity, I say that like every symbol of the encoding is like one subnet. So now the number of symbols you have is the number of subnets. Whereas in Ethereum, like they did a simple batching technique where like you just put like, let's say 64 symbols in one subnet, and now you have less number of subnets.
I see, because of the number of derivatives are also considered as symbols. That's why you
so the number of derivatives would still remain independent, but just like the Q number, so like how many points at which you're evaluating. But essentially the batching technique which Ethereum uses, we can also use the same tick. And like if you just batch like 64 symbols together, then you have less number of subnets.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Any other question? Okay, thanks, Aditi. Next, we have Lioba with more applied work looking at the blob fee market on Ethereum.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. So as was just said, I'm going to take you a bit more from theory to a bit of applied work where we looked at the early days of the Ethereum block market and then looked at the lessons we can learn by analyzing it. So my name is Lioba, and this is joint work with Jason, who's also in the audience today. So you can also ask him questions after the talk. And we're from ETH Zurich and Columbia University. So I want to start with some context as to what blocks are. As you already heard before, Ethereum wants to handle thousands of transactions per second, but scaling the layer 1 is not straightforward unless you really want to compromise on really increasing hardware requirements for the nodes, for instance. So instead of this scaling vertically, where you increase hardware requirements for nodes or make a single node more powerful, Ethereum has decided to also go the route of horizontal scaling by adopting a roll-up-centric roadmap. So scaling with these parallel chains that are referred to as layer 2s or roll-ups. And then in layer 2, what they do is they post data to the Ethereum layer 1. Essentially, they post the compressed transaction batches, so the transactions that were executed on the layer 2 for data availability on the Ethereum layer 1, and then the Ethereum layer 1 can verify and secure the layer 2. Now, for a time, this data, so the compressed transaction batches from the Ethereum layer 2s, it was being posted on the Ethereum 1 directly as call data to transactions. So this is the input data for an Ethereum transactions. And that essentially meant that these layer 2 transaction batches, they were competing for space with normal Ethereum layer 1 transactions. So if you want to make a transfer on Ethereum or a DEX swap, all these transactions on the layer 1 were competing for space with these transaction batches that were coming from the layer 2. And that essentially meant, for one, that it was quite expensive for these layer 2s to be posting their data, but it also meant that the scalability was still limited by how much the Ethereum layer 1 nodes are able to store long term, because they are persisting these transactions forever, essentially. So last year then, blobs were introduced as a solution to this, or to address this. And it's a cheaper space for rollups to store their data. So now, instead of storing these transaction batches as call data, which was persisted forever, it is now stored in what is known as blobs. And these blobs are then only stored temporarily by the Ethereum nodes for 18 days. So this time window should give enough time, essentially, to make sure that everything is going correctly on the layer 2 within these 18 days. And the introduction then also introduced a separate fee market on Ethereum specifically for these blob transactions. And this fee market is exactly what was of interest to us and what we wanted to understand, and really asking the question, how is this new fee market doing? So our paper here, it is primarily a measurement paper. So what we first needed to do is we needed to collect data, and we collected data from 3 different sources. For one, from the Ethereum blockchain, to get just data about which transactions include blobs and the fees that they're paying. Then we also looked at PBS relay data to get an understanding of who is actually building the blocks that include blobs. And finally, we also collected Ethereum network data because we wanted to understand when the transactions with blobs were first seen in the mempool and the blocks in which they were included to get an intuition about how long they're waiting for their block inclusion. Okay, so how do these blob transactions that I'm talking about actually look? What I'm showing on the slide now is the format of a normal Ethereum transactions with fields like to, from, and the fees that it's willing to pay. Now a blob transaction just has the 2 extra fields that I'm now showing on the slide as well. One indicates the max fee per blob gas a transaction is willing to pay. So essentially, this is the new field for this new fee market. And the other is references the associated blobs. These blobs, then, they are propagated separately now. And so they're not actually part of the blob transaction, which the blob transaction itself is still persistent forever, but these blobs are being propagated separately and only stored temporarily. Additionally, there is a limit on the number of blobs we can have in a transaction or in a block. It used to be 6. So the limit was 6 blobs maximum per transaction and also per block. And then the target, which is sort of the target for which the fee market is optimizing, was 3 blobs per block. These numbers have now changed to 9 and 6 respectively, but for this talk, I'll stay to these numbers as our data analysis was doing a time when this was the case. Okay, so what fees is a blob transaction now paying? A blob transaction really needs to pay fees in 2 markets now. Essentially, you can think of it that way, that this blue part of the transaction, which is the actual transaction, it still needs to pay fees in the normal Ethereum fee market, otherwise referred to as the EIP 1559 fee market. And essentially there, the transaction pays a fee, which is the product of the gas it consumes. Just think of the gas as a proxy for the complexity of a transaction. And the base fee, so this is a fixed fee per block that adjusts to the demand in the normal fee market, and then also a priority fee. So this is a tip that goes to the validator or builder for including the transaction. Then blob transactions, they also need to pay a fee in the separate market. This is the newly introduced market that we are studying in this work. And it's the blob fee market, or otherwise referred to as the EIP 48441. And again here, the fee that a transaction is paying is a product of the number of blocks, the number of blobs that it's included, and the blob base fee. So this blob base fee, it adjusts with demand, and it's also fixed per block. Essentially, when we're processing blobs above the target, then this increases and it decreases otherwise. Okay, so let's start at how this market actually looks like, or how blobs on Ethereum were in the early days. What I'm showing on the slide now is the daily number of blobs, so that's the blue line that you're seeing, and the daily target, that's the red line. So this is from the beginning of the introduction of blobs until the end of our measurement period, which was in October 2024. And essentially what you can see here is that blob adoption was increasing, but has really never reached the target for sustained periods of time, at least until the end of our measurement period. Now, when we also add the blob base fee to this blob, so the base fee that the transactions were paying for in the blob market, we can see that it's generally extremely low. So it's significantly below 1 gray. And we really see that this blob base fee is only increasing when the demand approaches the target. And there was one time around April 24, which was during the blobscription craze, and another time in late June 24, which was around the layer 0 airdrop. That happened on the Arbitrum chain, and then that led to an increased transaction volume on Arbitrum, which led to an increased demand for blobs from Arbitrum, which then led to a total increase in demands on Ethereum. Now we can also plot the fees that were being paid by the blob transactions a bit differently, so I'm plotting them cumulatively now, and this really just solidifies the picture that the blob transactions, they were really only paying fees during these 2 periods of time in the EIP 4844 market. Outside of these periods, you really don't see this cumulative amount of fees that they've been paying going up. Now, these blob transactions, as I said, they're not just paying fees in this blob fee market, they are also paying fees in the normal EIP 559 market. And now when we also add the base fee and priority fees that they're paying in the normal market into this plot, we really see that this looks different. They are steadily increasing. What is quite important to note here as well is that actually the blue line, so these are all the fees that the transactions are paying. Oh, I think I lost my slide. Okay, so now that you see the blue line again, the blue line is essentially the only part of the fee that is not being burned. This is the only financial incentives that are created for builders and validators to be including blob transactions, and it's very low. On average, it's less than $1 for every transaction that includes blobs, and this is in comparison to around $200, which is sort of the average priority fees that are in a block. So really what we're seeing is that blob transactions in these early days of the market have been paying very little fees, and that builders have received really only a very small proportion of that. However, this is in part at least due to this market still being new and the demand for blob transactions really not matching their availability. For example, even in this period of time, you see shifts where the priority fees, they really only start to increase once blob demand starts to approach the target in June. There you see the blue line really picking up. We do, however, even though in general demand wasn't there during our measurement period, have 2 periods of time with demand spikes that can offer some additional information about this new market when demand matches or even exceeds the availability. Thus, we also wanted to focus on the second period, so during the layer 0 airdrop, to see how the market behaves when it is congested. So for that, let's look at the fees that were being paid by blob transactions in the 2 markets by each transaction during this period of congestion. So on the slide now, what I'm showing is during the layer 0 airdrop, I'm showing around a 12-hour window around it, the fees that the blob transactions were paying. Essentially, each dot here is a transaction, and the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis, it's showing how high the base fee was. And what you can see for one is that the base fee in the blob market, it jumped 15 orders of magnitude in this relatively short window. What you can also see, and what is quite important to note, is that the price discovery here lasted 6 hours. So it took 6 hours for the price to rise to the new maximum, to the maximum, or to discover the price. And this was a result of essentially the base fee being extremely low when this demand started to pick up, and then it needed to move 15 orders of magnitude, which just takes some time, the way that the blob base fee adjusts. Now, given that we had this high demand in this market during this period of time, there was a lot of waiting for blob transactions. And what you would assume is that these blob transactions, that they're now increasing the priority fees in the normal Ethereum market because they have no priority fees in this market, and essentially every transaction in a block is paying the same. But when we look at the fees that these transactions were paying in the EIP 1559 market during this period of time, we really don't see much the EIP 1559 market being affected much. This is expected for the base fee because, again, blob transactions are just around 1% of all transactions, so we don't expect that an increase in demand there will really show up in the normal fee market. But we would have expected that these blob transactions would have increased the priority fees that they're willing to pay for swifter inclusion. But really, this didn't seem to be happening. Now, it was quite surprising for us to see such little changes in the bidding strategies from layer 2s in the normal fee market. But what we then also wanted to do is to really understand how these layer 2s are actually behaving in a bit more detail. So let's start by some overview of the daily share of blobs that are submitted by each of the layer 2s to really understand sort of who the big players are in this market. So I'm showing the biggest 9 players separately on this plot, and then the rest is grouped together. And quite importantly, I would say, it is that there are 4 layer 2s, which are Base, Arbitrum, Tycho, and Optimism, that account for around 3/4 of total blob usage. Then we also looked at how many blobs these layer 2s are actually submitting per transaction. So what the plot on the slide is now showing is we have a little plot for each of the 9 biggest layer 2s, and we're showing for each transaction that was included by them, it's a separate dot, and we're showing how many blobs there were in this transaction. So that's on the y-axis, and then time is again on the x-axis. And I think the first thing to notice here is that we see that the layer 2s, they started to adjust their submission strategies around June 24. This is a time where the blob demand slowly started to increase, and it's also shortly before the layer 0 airdrop, which is indicated by the vertical gray line. Now, during this time, you can, for example, see that Base and Optimism, they go from submitting 6 blobs per transaction to 5, and Arbitrum goes from 6 to 3. So it really seems that around this time, several rollups were diversifying their strategies due to the increased demand. We can only presume why this is happening, but a reason for this could be that they went from sort of using up the full capacity of a block, which is the 6 blobs, to a lower number, so that they would be included more quickly if there's also like one other transaction waiting in the mempool. Now, the other thing that we can notice is that on the day of the layer 0 airdrop, actually only really 2 rollups seemed to be adjusting their strategies in terms of the number of blobs included, and that is Optimism and Base. For them, we see that they are including transactions with various numbers of blobs during this really high demand period of time. Now, another thing we wanted to look at then for these layer 2s is also we wanted to understand how much priority fees are they actually willing to pay in the normal fee market. So remember that really the only thing they can choose, so that isn't given per block, is the priority fee. And that's also the only thing that offers an incentives to the validators and builders. So we wanted to understand what they're willing to pay in priority fee and what inclusion delays their transaction have. This not only gives us an insight into how much the respective rollups are willing to pay, but also offers insights into the effect of priority fees on prioritization for inclusion. Now, looking at this plot for priority fees, the thing that we really notice is that there are 2 rollups that stand out a bit, which are Scroll and Starknet, who have consistently extremely low priority fees. So the priority fees of them are consistently below 1 gray, and 1 gray is actually the minimum priority fee that is by default accepted by the GEF execution layer client, which is the biggest Ethereum execution layer client. Now, the remaining senders all have similar priority fees, I would say, but with varying distributions. When we go to the delay now, though, that's when things go a bit more interesting, because what we see is that really so the delay is just the time between when we first saw a transaction in the mempool and when the block was actually propagated in which it's included. And what we see here is that there's really no significant delay for Scroll and Starknet, even though they're paying such low priority fees. And it seems that, again, sort of given the low demand that we have in this market in comparison to the availability, that you don't need to bid significant priority fees for swift inclusion. So I want to now go to a second part of our analysis in which we identified and studied some inefficiencies that are currently prevalent in this market. So there's 2 issues that we look at. The first issue is that block packing is not optimally implemented currently. For that, we can look at the following examples. So we have 3 transactions that are waiting for inclusion in the mempool, and the first has 5 blobs, and then the other 2 have 3 blobs each. Now, the first pays 2 in priority fees, and the other 2 pay 1.99 in priority fees. Now, a naive, greedy algorithm, what it would do, it would sort all the transactions by how much they're willing to pay in priority fees, and then just pick them sort of until it's full. And that would mean, in this case, that it would just pick the first, I think we're back soon, yes. It would just pick the first transaction, essentially, and have a total priority fees of 2. Now, the optimal algorithm, assuming we have enough gas in the normal gas, would pick the other two transactions and nearly double the fees that it's getting, because it would be 3.98 in priority fees instead of 2. So what we wanted to understand is how optimally are blocks actually packed, and for that we looked at the proportion of suboptimal, optimal, and etc. blocks over time, and that is shown on the slide now. And essentially what you can see is that around 25% of blocks are packed suboptimally, while a similar and smaller proportion is packed optimally. Now, there is a very small proportion of blocks for which there wouldn't be enough gas in the EIP 1559 market if we were doing the optimal thing. That is shown in red. But really the largest proportion is in the middle. There we don't know whether they were packed optimally or suboptimally, because both algorithms would have resulted in the same packing. You can also see that this fraction is increasing over time. A potential reason for this could be that we saw these layer 2s really going from submitting these large number of blobs per transaction, 6, to a bit lower numbers, and then it was easier to do the packing. Now, this suboptimality in the block packing importantly leads to losses for builders, and it leads to delays for blob transactions. So on the builder side, we observe losses of up to 70%. And they're really the biggest around these periods of congestion that we've looked at. Interestingly, we also find that specialized builders are packing their blocks suboptimally and experiencing this loss. However, to us, it seems a bit like the investment into an optimal packing algorithm here is just not worth it, given the low revenue or the low financial incentives in this market. Now, importantly, this suboptimality, it is also affecting transaction inclusion delays. So we see small delays consistently as a result of this suboptimal packing, and the highest is around 6 blocks during the first period of high demand. So suboptimal packing really leads to these inefficiencies in the blob market. Now a solution for this would be to implement an optimal algorithm, which would be knapsack in this case. For the small number of blobs, it's quite easy to do that. When we scale to more blobs, an approximation would be appropriate. Now, the second inefficiency that we looked at is that subset bidding is currently not possible with the current transaction format. For that, consider the following example. So we have one transaction that includes one blob and is willing to pay 10 in priority fees. And then we have a second transaction with 6 blobs that is willing to pay 1 in priority fees. Now, the optimal algorithm, it would choose just the first transaction and then would not be able to include the second one. And we would have an unused capacity of around 5 blobs. Now, a very naive fix, you could say, for this would be, okay, what if we just say every transaction can only include 1 blob? But this is not a good solution, because for one, this would lead to us using an increased number of EIP 1559 gas, because we need these additional transactions, and essentially we would be wasting gas in the normal market, and it would also not allow us to offer any incentives or bundle premium to transactions that are bundling. So a solution for this would then be to allow transactions to essentially to bid for subsets, so to let transaction submitters bid for subsets of blobs to be included, and if there's not space for all of them. So last, I want to conclude with some lessons that we learned through our measurement analysis of these early days of the block market. So essentially, how can we improve it? Now for that, we have 2 dimensions, the blob fees and the block packing. On the fee side, a multidimensional priority fee market would be one to go, because currently we don't have priority fees on the blob market side, and we believe that adding this in each dimension could help scale fees appropriately during congestion. And this wasn't the case in the past, as we saw with the layer 0 case study. Also, increasing the minimum base fee could be a way to speed up price discovery when we have a sudden spike in demand. Now, on the block packing side, there I already hinted at what we could do to improve it. For one, improved packing algorithms would be beneficial to the market. And subset bidding would be an additional opportunity which would help in reducing unused capacity. Actually, there's one builder that had already implemented it last year, right after the Layer 0 airdrop, where we saw this real need for it. But really, it didn't get much adoption back then, during our measurement period at least. But in part, we believe that is due to there not being a further demand spike in the data we were looking at. Now, most importantly, though, the overarching theme that we noticed is that this fee market really needs some sort of infrastructure investment. Currently, the financial incentives are so small here that we believe this has led to some slow infrastructure development regarding blobs and has led to these inefficiencies persisting because the sort of financial incentives that are there to produce these better algorithms and so on are maybe not sufficient for this engineering effort. So with that, thank you for your attention, and you can see the link to the paper is there.
Thanks, Joba. Any questions?
Trying to get to the microphone here. Nice talk. One thing I wanted to point out was, I think it was during the Layer 0 situation. I was at base at the time. We were like in a war room because we saw the blobs not getting posted. And so, of course, our natural thought was, well, we're just not paying enough in fees, right? So you mentioned some of the adjustments we were making. We were cranking up priority fee multipliers, adjusting the number of blobs we were submitting, and still nothing was working. And it turned out, when we had dug into it a little bit, that there was a bug in Geth. And I don't know how much this influenced your results, but it was in the propagation algorithm for blobs. If there was a gap in the order in which they arrived, it would discard them. So the end result is that basically, no matter how much we were paying in fees, you'd hit a Geth client, and it'd be hit or miss depending on the order of arrival, whether they get propagated on. We fixed that bug, and that definitely helped a lot since then. But I'm just kind of curious if that's reflected in your data at all. I mean, I can point you to when it went live. It's one of the Geth releases. But that was really just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yes, I think actually that could be in part in our data where you see that the number of suboptimal blocks goes down a bit and this unknown fraction goes up a bit. So I could presume this is part of it, even though I am not sure to what extent sort of the data we have, because we were seeing them in the mempool, whether that would have been affected, so whether we're already seeing the effect.
Were you running Geth as the mempool analyzer, or was it something else?
No, I think it's several different ones. It's this Flashbot mempool dumpster, so I think it's several different clients. So I guess maybe we were also seeing them if they weren't in the Geth client. So that's a good thing. The other thing that we noticed is also that Geth seemed to have completely emptied the blob market at some point afterwards as well, that they were not propagating them at all. Is that the same thing, or is it something different?
I mean, it could result in them not being propagated at all. Usually, if you just one blob arrives, it's fine. But if there's multiple blobs that you're sending, then I don't remember the exact details of the bug, but it had to do with the order of arrival. And if it differed than the nonce of the underlying transactions, for example, I believe that was when they were getting basically just completely dropped, not even propagated.
Ah, okay.
And so you submit it to a Geth client, and there's a good chance it would just drop it on the floor.
Yeah.
No matter how many times you're resubmitting the transactions wasn't helping either.
Yeah.
And we're all panicking. And finally, I think someone else did some analysis, and when things started finally cooling down and working, the base fees had shot up so high that we ended up losing, well, I probably shouldn't say the number, but it was a lot of money in gas fees that we ended up overpaying for the chain to have to catch up.
Oh, okay.
So glad those days are past. That was stressful.
It's also very nice to get this inside perspective into what was happening at base while it was going on.
But nice talk. I mean, everything you said absolutely still applies. Thanks.
Thank you.
Let's drop from the blob trenches. Yeah, next question.
So you showed that the validators get very little fees from those blobs, and I guess there is still quite significant operational cost on propagating those blobs. Do you have an intuition whether the validators get even, like they gain money or they lose money on this part of the system?
I guess we don't know, but I think your question also goes into a bit of the same direction, that really there seem to be so little financial incentives here that it just doesn't really seem worth it to be investing money in it. For example, the GEF bug also seems to be of a similar nature to some extent, that we need to create all these new infrastructure for this blob fee market, but the financial incentives aren't there to cover sort of this initial investment that needs to be taking place from all sides, client teams, validator propagation, and so on. So no, we didn't specifically look at whether now they're breaking even, the validators. I cannot tell you whether they are. Probably they're not earning a lot. Yeah, it is not a very profitable thing for them to be doing, to be including blobs, probably.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I have a question. So I'm not sure I understand, agree with like one of the lessons learned that like the multidimensional priority fee would help. Yeah, can you like maybe expand on that?
Yeah, I think maybe it would just make it a bit easier. Sorry, I'm trying to talk into the mic. Maybe it would make it just a bit easier on the algorithm side to really prioritize those that are paying in the congested market. It would, in the end, it doesn't change much. Of course, you can also go and pay priority fees in the normal EIP 1559 market, but since we didn't really see that happening in the past, and we think that the way the algorithms are being implemented on the client side and the builder side isn't fully taking that into account appropriately, it would maybe just make it similar if we can directly look at the priority fees in the respective congested market.
Got it. Because like, if I wanted to express like higher willingness to pay for those transactions, I could already do it today.
Yes,
with like
exactly.
the 1559 priority fee.
Yeah, I think this isn't something like a very fundamental change in that sense. It is already possible. We didn't see it being used. And this is just, we presume that's because it's not appropriately taken into account, and that would just make it a bit easier.
All right, thanks. And let's thank Lioba again. Yeah, now we have the short talks session.
All right. The lightning talk session. If you have the feeling that 30-minute slots are really very long, then this is the session for you, because the slots here are 3 minutes. People are already queuing up, that's great. Yeah, just to, here's the format, right? If you want to speak, you get the mic for 3 minutes. Please queue up here. Please, you get the mic for 3 minutes. Please all be nice to each other. You can plug in your laptop here. I'll be sitting there in the front row giving you the 1 minute, please close kind of thing after 2 minutes. And if then after 1 minute you're not done, then I'm going to do this. And yeah, then we're going to see what happens next. And with that, let's just get started.
All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Rami. I'm a protocol engineer at RISC-0. Today, I just want to introduce you guys to something called Kailua, which is state-of-the-art for protecting rollups with ZK. Essentially, Kailua allows you to switch between fault proving and validity proving on demand using ZK proofs. The advantages of Kailua is that the participation costs in the dispute games are basically constant for honest participants, regardless of how much the adversary is spending to attack your chain with bad state proposals. Safety is guaranteed if at least one honest actor just shows up periodically to publish one transaction, regardless of how many transactions the adversary is doing or how many different disputes they're starting. The collateral requirements are just at minimum the cost of generating one ZK proof. So that's the amount of collateral you put up, and then you get to publish as many claims about the state root as you want. And that's about like $100 in practice. So much lower order of magnitude than other interactive dispute games. The size of a fault proof is configurable in exchange for a slight overhead in DA costs. And also proving can be safely delegated externally because there are no time limits on how fast you have to generate a proof. So you can send your proving request to a decentralized proving protocol like Boundless Network, and delays in proving only affect the liveness or only cause withdrawal delays essentially, but funds are safe as long as you just make honest proposals on time. This is currently deployed on the Build on Bitcoin mainnet. It only costs half an ETH in collateral to try and submit a fault proof or submit a honest proposal. It took them from the others category on L2B back to stage 0. It essentially sets you up for stage 2, but they're stage 0 just because of the other requirements for exit windows and committees. It's fully open source, built at RISC-0/Boundless. It's under active review by a lot of big names and under very serious consideration. So yeah, I don't have slides, so just look up RISC-0, Kailua, Boundless, and yeah, hit me up if you have any questions about the details or how it works or you want any links. Thank you.
One quick public service announcement. A wallet was found. If you believe that you lost your wallet, you can go talk to the AV staff in the back and convince them that it's actually your wallet.
Hey everyone, my name is Marek Krzyzewski. We're going to be talking about Self protocol today. Who here likes to give their KYC information to centralized entities that frequently get hacked? Anybody? Anybody? One person in the front. Amazing. All of you other people are a little more rational, I think. What about this one? Who here likes not knowing if you're talking to a human or an AI agent on Twitter? Do I have a... Oh, one person. A lot of other people also do not like this fact. It's a crazy world we live in today. What about mixing your funds with bad actors, indexes, lending pools, or other smart contracts? Do we have a taker? One person in the back, 2 people. Amazing. Okay, so for all of the other people in the audience, I have a new protocol for you. It's called Self protocol. It's a new decentralized identity protocol that leverages ZK Passport technology to basically solve this and many other problems that you might be facing today. And the way it works is it leverages what I like to call is the most trusted attestation of who you are in the meet space, which of course is your passport. Who here has a passport? This is not a trick question now. Amazing. Passports are difficult to obtain. People tend to store them pretty securely because you need them for travel. But they're also machine readable, especially these biometric passports that have the little logo in the bottom right of the slide. These can be read by your phone because inside the NFC chips on these passports, your biometric data is cryptographically signed with the certificate authority chain that can be verified. So it's possible to verify the authenticity of one of your passports. They did this so you can't forge them when you're entering a new country. But it turns out that we can also use these to prove that you have a valid passport, that you are in fact a human, without a counterparty, because we can verify the facts in these passports. You can verify, the certificate authority chain in a smart contract today. So you don't need to actually show your passport to anyone else. And even better than that, you can do that in ZK. So you can prove that you have a valid passport without revealing anything about yourself. And on top of that, you can then, once you've done that, you can prove that statements about yourself are true without revealing necessarily much about yourself. So you can prove that you're a citizen of any country, so you're human. You can prove that you're a citizen of a specific country without revealing anything else. You can prove that you're above or below a certain age, that you're not from a set of countries, that you're not on the OFAC list using a Merkle exclusion proof. You could prove that your first name is something, or you have a birthday, or you have a certain hair color, particularly good for meme coins. And you can associate all of these proofs with wallet addresses. All of this is live today, and it's audited by ZK Security. And big companies are now starting to use it. So just 2 weeks ago, we announced that Google Cloud is using this for their Web3 AI search product, their testnet faucet, and their mainnet faucet. So if you're at all interested, definitely come talk to me afterwards. Really excited to chat.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maxwell Kogler. I'm a student at Lake Oswego High School. And I just had a quick presentation for you on blockchain, the potential of blockchain as a decentralized inter-agent collaboration incentive. So the blockchain stands to be a market for verifiable knowledge and intellectual labor. When it comes to distributed systems like the blockchain, we can use kind of financial systems like this to act as a market for intellectual labor, so outsourcing between agents. So if one agent is incapable of doing a certain task or might not have the same capabilities of another model that's available, we can use the blockchain to act as a market between models that may be more efficient or more productive at doing certain tasks. The same goes for cooperative model learning. If a certain model doesn't have, or a certain agent doesn't have the capacity to understand something and it wants to grow, we can use the blockchain as an incentive between, or like basically an incentive layer between models to be able to communicate and share information. Again, this goes for resource access. So maybe a tool that a certain agent wants to use to complete a task may not be directly available to them for free. And so using the blockchain as an incentivization layer could be a very interesting development for being able to get tools to certain models. What's the value of the blockchain? It's verifiable public training and inference proofs that can be used to verify the integrity of agent operations as well as resources available to these agents. So it's all trackable, it's all public, and it's all financially secure. Operation flow and MCP alignment. So the model context protocol could act as a primary communication channel between agents and certain models that are looking to connect with each other. And this could also lead to like subtask delegation. But on the blockchain side of things, traceable MCP communications could be used as evidence for payments between models. So we'd kind of negotiate prices of resources and prices of learning or prices of operations using like the MCP layer, and then these payments could be executed through a blockchain system. As I said earlier, you can purchase time, API access, special tools, and data all using a system like this. So there's a lot of potential here. I know there's a lot of people here that are working on something like this, but I think it's really interesting. Future research, smart contract structuring, using ZKML within these certain smart contracts to be able to verify inferences so that models aren't lying and then getting funding for improper inference. Verifiable training and verifiable testing. If you're looking to train a model on chain, you can verify these using ZKML structures within smart contracts and automations, and there's all sorts of things. Model collateral frameworks. If a model wanted to kind of take out maybe like an operation loan from another agent, so wanted to get something from an agent without directly providing it with incentive, it could actually use its own model as collateral. And so then you could use, that model could kind of slowly leak what makes it special or makes it specialized if it is unable to pay back some of these incentivization loans. MCP interfacing as well, being able to connect the incentive layer with the model context protocol would be critical to getting these kind of models connected and together. And there's plenty more research, of course, so this is a really quick topic. Thank you. You can talk to me, find me after if you want anything clarified. I've got an archive profile, and my LinkedIn's up there too if you want to talk to me. So.
Okay, struggling with the slides. One moment, please. Okay, I guess I have to do it without the slides. I'm just here on the stage to tell you about what we are currently working on at Dateo. I'm Roman from Dateo, the lead cryptographer there, and we are building a privacy-preserving version of a hash map that can be used to bring, for example, a Solidity mapping primitive to private state blockchains like Adstack and Aleo. And what we want from this primitive is that on one hand, it should be representable as a succinct commitment on-chain. On the other hand, you want to have efficient proofs, your knowledge proofs that you actually read and the correct values from the hash map and also write the values to the hash map. And very crucially for us, what we want from this primitive is that we want to hide both the keys and the values that are stored in the hash map, even from the parties that actually store the actual data set. I want to talk a little bit about our construction that we are considering so far. On the highest level, we are implementing it as a sparse Merkle tree, which allows us to actually only store the elements that are actually present in the data set, but it enables us efficient membership, non-membership, and update proofs. Going one abstraction layer deeper, each layer in this Merkle tree we implement as an MPC-ified version of a cuckoo table, which essentially enables us to read and write to this layer without leaking the actual keys and values that we use for writing and reading. And this cuckoo table is internally backed by two oblivious RAM primitives and a growable stash. And for the oblivious RAM, we are currently implementing it following the duo-RAM paper, which essentially gives us a very low communication overhead, the network overhead, which is only logarithmic in the ORAM size. But this comes at the cost of a high CPU bottleneck, and that is caused by generating so-called distributed point functions that are used in the duo-RAM for reading and writing obliviously. And generating this distributed point function is also the main bottleneck for our current prototype of our oblivious hash map. I just wanted to bring this out here. If you are interested in having such a privacy-preserving hash map, if you want to use it on your projects, if you have ideas to optimize, just find me after this talk. I'm happy to chat, happy to collaborate, and thank you for your attention. And sorry for not having the slides up there.
So, hey everyone, I'm Shashank, and we've been building this project called PriVote. So, what is the project? It's just a polling application where you can go and create polls, share with people whom you want to vote, and they can come and vote, and everything is on-chain. So, on-chain polls have been there for a long time, and they solve a critical problem, which is of trust. Since everything is in code, which is in a blockchain, you don't have to trust anybody for the whole process, and whoever votes everything, the whole process is trustless. So there is no fishy thing going on in back so as to allow anyone else to win than who is allowed to win. But there is a critical problem there with mostly blockchains, all EVM compatible blockchains are public. So if you go and vote to any poll, anyone can go and see, okay, this address voted for this poll. And this poses a problem. For example, in real world elections, you do not announce everyone whom you are going to vote or whom you voted. But as on-chain polls solve some problems, then this came as a critical problem there, because you cannot hold real-world elections or an actual confidential polls there. So yeah, we are working on solving that. So we work with PSE on along with Massey. This allows you to have polls on-chain in a private way. So you can deploy Massey on any chain, any EVM compatible chain. You can start having polls as per wallet login, and people can come and vote, and all your votes would be encrypted when they go on-chain. So no one would be able to see whom you voted for, and all this is done with help of ZK circuit. So it ensures the person whom you voted for, only that vote counts. So no one can do the fishy things here as well, and no one in the world can know whom you voted for. So if you want to try it out, you can go on privote.live, create polls. So yeah, if you are doing on-chain polls, like anyone can create any number of wallets. So we have some verification protocols here. If someone owns some NFT, if someone have some certain tokens, you can put a whitelist and create a poll and share it with people. Now, there is a coordinator needed. So at the end, what would be published is like total sum of votes of all the options. So you would be able to see who won, but you would not be able to see whom everyone voted for. So you can go and create polls and share it with people. You can choose your own gatekeeper verification method. We have a poll going on right now with like how likely you are to attend the SBC conference again. You can go to privote.live and vote. So this is in testnet as of now, so you can vote for free. And if you want to talk about this, you want to create poll, you can for sure connect with me afterwards. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. So today I want to talk to you guys about our latest paper on cross-chain arbitrage. This is a joint work with folks from Flashbots, Technical University of Munich, and University of Lisbon. And price discovery today on markets happen usually on off-chain markets like centralized exchange. And then because we have like similar assets on on-chain markets as well, we usually need arbitrage between these decentralized exchange and centralized exchange to simply have efficient markets on-chain as well. But in a decentralized world, ideally, where DeFi wins, we expect the liquidity to then flow in on-chain, and thus we expect price discovery to also happen on-chain. And because we will have eventually markets which offer the similar assets on different chains, we expect arbitrage between different chains to be the primary mechanism for achieving price parity. We studied this mechanism in this paper through a theoretical model which tells us if we should hold an inventory or use a bridge to conduct an arbitrage. And we conduct the first empirical study on executed arbitrage across 9 different chains for a 1-year period. So we deem that the 2 strategies, holding inventory or using a bridge, can be decided based on the asset volatility, the bridging duration, or the frequency of opportunities coming up. So for example, using an inventory is faster, like you can do the trade simultaneously, but you have to manage inventory across different chains, which could be a complex thing. Otherwise, you can use a bridge, which means like you have to go wait for a longer period to complete the arbitrage, which then means you can get front run, but is a relatively trivial strategy. We show that depending on the conditions of the bridge and the assets, you can decide one of the 2 strategies. We have a model for this. And our empirical study shows that there's around 860 million volume conducted through such arbitrage in this 1-year period. The activity significantly increased after the Denkun upgrade with the introduction of blobs, which makes sense because the trading fees dropped down on these L2s. We find that around 67% of the arbitrage didn't use a bridge. They took an inventory position, which makes sense because they settled much faster, like in 9 seconds. But still, it's quite interesting that among the 33% remaining bridge arbitrage, 28% of them used a native bridge, like between Ethereum and Polygon, which then took around 20 minutes to complete. So comparing this to the high-frequency trading activities we talk about, like the classic Flash Boys action, which you try to save milliseconds, completing an arbitrage on chain in 20 minutes is a crazy thing. And finally, we see that as following all other MEV strategies, there's a centralization in who extracts this MEV. 40% of all volume was extracted by a single guy. And we discussed that this can lead to incentive to vertically integrate between sequencers, staking providers, and these HFT shops. And we discussed decentralizing block building or lowering entry barriers for this market can help enable mitigate these risks. You can find the preprint, a detailed blog post on the methodology, and a sample repo with such cross-chain arbitrage through these links. Thank you.
we'll get there. Okay, maybe we won't get there. Let's, there it is. Cool. Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to give you an introduction of Kwai Network. What is Kwai Network? Kwai Network is a scalable proof-of-work blockchain designed to function as a global monetary system. To function as a global monetary system, you fundamentally need three characteristics. You need to be able to function as a store of value, a medium of exchange, and a unit of account. To accomplish this, we actually introduced two tokens. One is Kwai. It's EVM compatible, and it has a traditional deflationary monetary policy. The other one is something we called Chi. We called Chi an energy dollar. And I'll go over that a little bit more in a second. But it effectively can function as a unit of account, as well as a medium of exchange, because it has cash-like privacy properties. How does Chi work? We use the process of proof-of-work mining to basically issue Chi in such a way that it reflects the cost of miners' electricity costs. And we use market mechanisms to cause Chi to then converge back to that production cost. So we effectively have a tokenized sort of unit of energy on chain, which ideally can function as a stablecoin alternative that's not denominated in fiat US dollars or has risk against custodians, et cetera. Now, with this monetary system, it isn't very meaningful unless it can go to a global scale. So with Kwai, we've actually created a new architecture. We use a merge mine hierarchy of blockchains to create kind of like a hierarchy like this. It allows us to shard state without sharding work, and it allows us to dynamically increase transaction throughput with demand. So this allows for parallelized processing across all these chains, but it also allows global consensus to be achieved through the use of sort of interlinked superblocks, creating these dominant chain referencing. This mechanism also actually incentivizes self-organized, topologically optimal subnets. So as the number of shards increases, the performance of each shard actually increases because there's lower latencies and tighter subnets. This gets us to more than 50,000 TPS while maintaining sub-penny fees sort of in perpetuity. But with that, sort of a picture is worth 1,000 words, a video's worth even more than that. So this, we'll get there. This is a video of a 2x2 ontology of Kwai network functioning. So this is really what scalable proof of work looks like, and you can see the hierarchy of blockchains kind of evolving. And you'll also notice on the bottom there, we have something called work shares, which is another sort of piece that we think creates much faster consensus in proof of work setting. And if anyone wants to talk about that, come and see me after. So, yeah. And just advisor list, also Dionysius at Common Prefix co-authored 2 papers with us. So if you see him or you see me, yeah, you can ask any questions. Thanks.
Hi guys, I'm David. I work on routing mechanisms. I'm going to try to be quick, but thank you for sticking around. The reason I'm here is to present an interesting problem because we could use academic help. We have a mechanism that the nodes in the network will propagate transactions. In most mechanisms, they want to hoard them. Here they share them. And here's what's interesting. There's one situation in which you're not going to do that. And the situation you don't do that with is if you've got a side deal. If you're selling your transaction to a node for another form of utility. Now, in other mechanisms, you can't see these side deals. In our mechanism, you can't see them either, but you know they exist. The mechanism has information in the form of these routing SIGs that tell you that only one guy got it. And it's really interesting because we've got a form of information about collusion, and collusion is what blocks incentive compatibility in proof of work and proof of stake mechanisms. So in the language of mechanism design, what we think we have is an indirect combinatorial double auction. There are not many of these. The weird thing is it's permissionless, and we don't know of any other mechanism that is permissionless indirect combinatorial auction. If you are doing mechanism design, you know, instead of having a bunch of different fees, you can have one fee, and a broadcast strategy, we think it gets us incentive compatibility, we could use help. Everyone that we know of who's writing about incentive compatibility is focused on direct mechanisms. They're coming out with impossibility proofs. No one is working on routing SIGs and broadcast strategies and indirect mechanisms. So yeah, it's just really weird because collusion could refer to massive amounts of undisclosed preferences, and that means the revelation principle, we can't even necessarily reduce these down to direct mechanisms because there's too many preferences. So thank you for listening. If you guys are working on this, feel free to reach out to me. I'm David. The project is SAITO, and I'll hope to talk to you. Thank you.
Maybe just a quick clarification. We'll just keep going with this session until we basically run out of talks. So technically, in like 5 minutes, there's going to be the lunch break. There'll be food outside. But yeah, as long as there's people who want to give talks, we'll keep going. And if you still want to give a talk, get your slides ready and come up.
Hey, I'm part of Institute of Free Technology, and we have a bunch of projects in our portfolio. One of them is Status. You might have heard of it. It's a privacy-focused web chat application. There's also Waku, which was formerly known as Whisper. It was part of the Ethereum white paper. Today, I am going to discuss about Status Network, which is a natively gasless ETH layer 2 rollup. So what we are building a natively gasless Ethereum layer 2, which would have a sustainable native yield and an integrated public funding protocol. So this is an open source Apache 2 licensed L2 stack. It's supposed to be free for everyone to use to spin up their own rollups as well. And we are working with Linea on this to create this sort of a Linea stack and along with the consensus team. You can also check out Logos, which is a decentralized technology stack. It includes Waku, the P2P communications protocol, the Codex, which is a decentralized storage protocol, Nomos and Alvin, which is very privacy focused. So all of that is included here. If you are very interested in privacy, you would really find that attractive. Yeah, so why gasless as a rollup? It gives the user better UX. At the same time, there is a race going on where the rollup gas fees is going to zero, and there are actors who are essentially using it for free or negligible cost for MAV or other purposes. It's not a stable revenue source. So we run a thin operational team, and we generate revenue from other sources like native yield on the chain. So how are we doing this? Essentially, we have modified the base2 ETH client. I'm developing 2 plugins. One is for the RPC, RPC node and a sequencer node. We are using RLN. If you might be aware, it's rate limiting nullifiers. Uses CK Tech to generate proof for creating these rate limits. And these are essentially rated through a soul-bound token called Karma. So it has essentially, you have spam protection through RLN using these Karma tiers. So yeah, I don't think I have time for explanation about RLN, but you can read a bit about that. Yeah, so we have the prover who essentially the RPC node would send all of those transactions to a prover network, and that would create the RLN proof. We have benchmarked it to about 500 TPS. The prover can handle at 256 threads, approximately 2 proofs generated per second per thread. Yeah, and the base2 node also runs in the sequencer mode. And we have there a validator, which is the RLN verifier. Before anything enters into the mempool of the sequencer, it essentially verifies the proof, the RLN proof. And then lastly, we have the gas estimation by Linea, by modifying the RPC method, which essentially would help the user get the sense of whether they have to pay the fees or not based on their consumption of the chain. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for your time.
Hello everyone. I'm Lucian, a PhD student at Georgia Tech and an intern at Visa Research. So today I would like to talk about powers of tau and its setup ceremony. So what is power of tau? So it's basically a common reference string with a structure, with a group of elements with a structure that is a secret, with a structure of powers of tau. So power of tau is very essential for zero knowledge proof and polynomial commitment. So it enables a lot of useful application in blockchain, like data sharding, like the prompt data sharding, which is potentially useful for the data availability solution for Ethereum, and a lot of privacy-preserving cryptocurrency and like layer 2 web solutions. So previously, there's a proposal by Nico Lacko, who proposed a setup ceremony for power of tau. So the purpose of a decentralized setup ceremony is to enable as much contributor as possible, and no one can perform censorship on the contributor. So no one can know all the secrets inside by protecting the security of powers of tau, the tau. And the way they do it is they let the power of tau string reside on smart contracts so that anyone can submit contribution on it. And the smart contract will propose essentially two checks. The first two checks are the most important. You need to show that the contributor really knows the secret that the randomness is contributing, but it does not support batching. We'll talk about batching later. The second check is to show that the string is indeed well-formed. And it's very expensive because the contributor, the smart contract need to run linear numbers of elliptic curve operations on a smart contract, which is very expensive, and we are not very happy with that. So we propose an improvement on it. We want to reduce the gas consumption so that we lower the financial cost and the barrier for contributors. So we propose two key mechanisms to reduce the cost. The first is optimistic update mechanism. So now the contributor can just upload the string, the contribution on it, and the smart contract won't perform the expensive elliptic curve operations. But if there is someone found out this ill-founded string on chain, he can challenge it by submitting a constant cost fault proof to it, and it's very cheap. And then the second mechanism is that we now allow a trustless operator to aggregate a bunch of contributions together, compress it into one single submission, and then he just upload it on chain. And we use some BLS signature-like techniques to allow such compression and allow the contributor can verify their contributions are indeed embedded inside this contribution. Yeah, so now the cost is amortized, it will become much cheaper. And we have implemented our idea. Now, as you can see, the gas cost for contribution is reduced by 33 times, and the fault proof is cheap. It's cost you just $2 on it. And now we support a 2 to the power 13 degree of power of tau on Ethereum. Yeah, so I hope it will make a difference. And that's it. Yeah.
Sweet. Hello, everyone. My name is Tanay. I work as a researcher at Propellerheads, and I would like to talk to you about an open source tool we've been working on for the last few months to essentially level the playing field between market makers, solvers, and researchers competing in on-chain auctions like CowSwap or Uniswap X. To kind of quickly give you some context about why this is relevant, as a market maker or a solver, the liquidity coverage that you have, basically the number of dexes you can route liquidity through, improves your price competitiveness. However, this comes with massive infrastructure requirements where you need to integrate each dex manually, and that can be a major barrier to entry, which can take anywhere from 3 to 4 months to kind of integrate the basic dexes before you can even start getting competitive. So this open source library essentially allows you to kind of access all of on-chain liquidity through one standard interface without having to worry about these integrations yourself. There are three key components to Tycho. There is the indexer, the simulator, and the executor. The indexer essentially allows you to access DEX liquidity, the latest state of a DEX through a WebSocket stream that you can kind of evaluate to have the map of global liquidity. And this is without you having to run your own infrastructure or worry about slow RPCs as well. So once you have a map of global liquidity, you want to be able to simulate your strategy. If you have to split a route across Uniswap, Curve, and Balancer, or if you want to split it across an RFQ provider and a few DEXs, your strategy needs to have like super fast simulation infrastructure to be able to do so. And Tycho provides you with just that in a simple and accessible way. So finally, once you have a route that you would like to kind of execute on chain, you get the infrastructure to basically encode this trade route and then send it on chain to kind of route through. To kind of talk about the more recent developments that we've made to Tycho, using the router, you can essentially save a lot on gas costs to improve price competitiveness. We chain transfers between pools instead of sending it back to the router, which allows you to kind of get this advantage. And more recently, we've been working with a lot of hooks and RFQ providers to essentially allow you to also compose off-chain liquidity with on-chain liquidity so that you ensure you have like full global liquidity coverage. And like a final call to action, we've been working with a lot of researchers to kind of use this DEX data to build a markout calculator, for example. And this is an open bounty that we have right now. So if you are interested in like building a real-time markout tool to measure profitability of liquidity providers across various DEXs, please don't hesitate to reach out. And secondly, we will also be making all of the historical DEX state open source through a BigQuery dataset, which will be accessible as a public good. So if any of these ideas seem interesting to you, please scan the QR code and reach out. I'd love to have a chat with you. Thank you.
Nope. Ah, there you go. Free option, ePBS. That is a thing that I've been recently exploring with mostly Bruno Masora from Flashbots. I'm Christoph from Flashbots. Also Burak collaborated on this with us, and Fei Wu from King's College. So what is a free option problem? ePBS is a current proposal, an Ethereum improvement proposal, 7732, which is one of the main candidates for headliner in the so-called Glamsterdam upgrade to Ethereum. And what you need to know for this particular problem is that it uses two deadlines. So you commit to a block if you build a block, and then you have actually two deadlines to first tell us about what is in the block, and then you have another deadline to tell us what are the blobs that are in the block. And if you fail to deliver either the payload or the block is canceled. And you can use that gadget to invalidate blocks if, I don't know, something happens in the world that might make you prefer not to publish the block, rather publish an empty block. Okay, that's a free option problem. It gives you about 8 seconds of option window, and we wanted to figure out, okay, how much value does it give us and how many empty blocks would it produce if it would be applied just to the current Ethereum system, blocks that are currently built in Ethereum, right? And here are some graphs. Option value is on average low, but it is high on high volatility days, so you can make above 100,000 US dollar on high volatility days with this option, realized value, right? And there, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 days per year where this is very highly profitable. And on these days, you have
basically considerable fraction of empty blocks that you would produce if you exercise this option. So we are north of 4%, 4 to 6% of empty blocks if people would use this option whenever it is profitable to use this option. So on high volatility days, you get a lot of empty blocks if this ERP is implemented the way it is. One caveat, this is probably the lower bound because we just looked at realized blocks. Probably people would build different blocks, right? Take on more risk, and then you get more empty blocks if they would really milk that option. It's a function of volatility. The more volatile stuff is, the more likely is this we produce empty blocks, and it is a function of liquidity. If there would be more liquidity on-chain, people would use that option probably even more. So this is an invitation to check out our draft on the problem and also to maybe research mitigation mechanisms to this problem or to figure out, okay, what the hell is going on? If you want to know more about it, ask me after the talk.
Hey everyone, I'm Harsha. I'm the co-founder at Reclaim Protocol. I'm here with my other co-founder, Madhavan, who's clicking pictures for me. I'm sorry about the lazy single slide for this presentation, but I think this should do the job. We are building Reclaim Protocol. Reclaim makes HTTPS traffic verifiable, thereby allowing users to import their data from any of the web server quite securely. Like, think of a person will be able to generate a proof of their age by logging into a government portal in a secure way. In fact, there are a bunch of products right now in UK who allow the user to log in into the NHS portal to generate a proof of their age. One quite humbling experience or learning that we had was this particular tech, Reclaim Protocol, got a lot of adoption from Web2 companies quite organically. I'd like to discuss more more actual real use cases that have been developed on top of Reclaim Protocol. There are a bunch of job marketplaces that were built on Reclaim, which verify the user based on their employment and education history. There is another market that got a lot of, that gives a lot of traction, which is the lending market. There is a fintech company in India which verifies the user address based on Amazon, Uber, and food delivery apps. It's one of the crazy use cases because right now it's entirely extremely cost inefficient to send someone physically and verify the user address. Reclaim is right now also being used to aggregate financial data from a lot of traditional financial institutions. A lot of brands generate a proof of unique views on Instagram and YouTube because Instagram does not expose APIs. They are currently using Reclaim Protocol to fetch that information and give out payouts to these content creators. There are also some really cool Web3 projects. 3Jane, which does credit on-chain lending based on off-chain credit data. We have Vana, which is a data DAO. Humanity Protocol, which issues verified credentials and thereby works with travel businesses to give out rewards based on these credentials. We have ZK P2P and P2P.me, which are like on-ramp, off-ramp platforms, which use Reclaim to generate a proof of a fiat transaction. We also have Sophon, T-Rex, and apologies to many clients whom I'm not able to mention here. But yeah, the most exciting part is ZKPs are being used right now in production for the last, I think, around 8 months now since we have been live in production with Web2 projects. And I'm incredibly proud that we are able to take an academic research and put it in the hands of Web2 projects. Web2 basically optimizes only for two things. Is it compliant and is it user-friendly? And I'm happy that we are able to deliver both. Thank you so much. If you have any questions on the technical, I'm here for the next few minutes. Thank you.
Is it showing up? Okay, so let me talk about Bitcoin mining. How many of you think Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment? A lot of you, right? So this is actually kind of the kind of mainstream narrative about Bitcoin mining. And I think for us, as an industry, right, we need to fight these arguments. And I don't think we need to say too much about like, okay, Bitcoin. It's non-controversial that Bitcoin mining consumes a lot of electricity. But there's also a lot of argument in the industry saying that, well, a lot of Bitcoin miners use renewable energies. So if they use renewable energies, then presumably it may be carbon neutral, right? So, but what I'm going to show you today is a latest research that we have done, and we can tell you that if we design the electricity pricing policy well, Bitcoin mining can not only be carbon neutral, but actually can also lower the total carbon emission in the entire industry, entire economy. And this basically utilized the fact that maybe some of you have heard about people talking about this, is that there's a very unique feature about renewable energy in that their supply is very intermittent, and it's not always come in sync with the demand for demand for electricity. So this is why, like, even if we have all the technologies for renewables, there's still need for fuel energies to power the power plants so that we can absorb any imbalance between electricity demand and supply. But Bitcoin mining has this very unique property is that because proof of work is memoryless, right? So we can actually, if we design the electricity pricing policy well, we can induce the miners to turn on and turn off their mining machines at the appropriate time. And this basically becomes the shock absorber, and that basically can replace fuel energy and to balance any asynchrony between the supply of electricity and the demand for electricity. So I'm going to skip all that. So in the paper, what we did, we developed a model about the electricity demand of the electricity market. There's the demand for electricity. There's the supply for electricity. There's a regulator setting up the pricing policies for electricity. And there's also the mining grid deciding on their renewable energy investment decisions. But we're going to skip, given the short amount of time, we're going to skip all the details of the math. But just to show you one graph, and there's one parameter in our paper that is basically just like how much Bitcoin mining do you ration when there is not enough electricity supply from renewables. And what we find is that as this parameter increases, initially the carbon emission will increase. But there's going to be a sweet spot in which if we find the right parameter, the total carbon emission in the entire economy can actually go down. So this is actually what we can now say very loudly to the outsiders, that Bitcoin mining, if we design it well, it can actually be green and it's good for the environment. So if you, of course, there's a lot of detail I'm glossing over. So if you're interested, here's the papers, and you can feel free to check it out. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Maxim. You might see in some of my work, one of which is why and how Zk-Snark works. And today I'm going to talk about non-membership key value trees. So why would you want a key value tree? There are several reasons. One is dictionaries such as nullifiers and serial numbers used in privacy-preserving blockchains. They're also used for global state, such as Merkle-Patricia tree in Ethereum, and also for authority data such as whitelist, backlist, and for compliance reasons. One of possible solutions is a sparse Merkle tree, and one of previous presenters mentioned it. So basically what is sparse Merkle tree is it's mapping key to leaf number in a giant Merkle tree, and each leaf represents an element. But it requires, the problem with sparse Merkle tree, it requires 2 lambda depths, where lambda is a security parameter. So for 128 bits of security, you need 256 levels of the tree. So it's too expensive in zero-knowledge proofs. And the reason for this is because of two-way collision, which is basically saying that after 128 bits of work, you have good probability that a collision will occur. And if collision occurs, basically this means that leaf will gonna overflow. And the natural question is, should we try to store multiple elements per leaf? And also, like, can it help us to reduce the tree depths? And to find the answer for this, we can look into hardness of multi-collision, and classic example of which is birthday collision. And so, which is saying basically that for two persons to have the same birthday, you would need a group of 23 people, and for 10 people to have the same birthday, you would need 1,400 people, which is a significant increase, right? So this leads to tree depth reduction. So if we fix leaf capacity to 64 elements, you can actually reduce the tree depth to 125 levels, which is 2x reduction, which is very significant. There are also like app-specific versions with tree depths down to log n, which is next to the optimal. This approach also can be used to reduce tree depths of Merkle-Patricia tree. So one of cool properties of this construction is constant time lookups, and it's very efficient overall. You can find the paper on ePrint. And last but not least, I think majority of real-world applications today are very hard to build with current day technology. And whatever we see today is just a tip of the iceberg, applications. That's why I'm working on ZK-based network that enables real-world applications. And if you want to help bring this vision to reality, please come find me and talk to me, or reach out on Twitter. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about Conduct Protocol. We're a new approach to blockchain decentralization that fits right in your pocket and in your cell phone. So we all know that Web3 faces challenges. Partial decentralization is one of the biggest. Complex node operations is another. And tough user experience and suboptimal UX. Conduct Protocol aims to solve these by making your mobile phone a full-fledged blockchain node. Yes, actually, your phone. So today's smartphones are actually powerful computers. They're always connected and they're always with you. They're the ideal medium for true decentralization. Our solution is a single mobile wallet app distributed through app stores for easy adoption. This app does everything: wallet operations for both Conduct and Bitcoin, staking, and critically, full node operation. Under the hood, it's validating, sharing, and extending the blockchain, just like server-based nodes currently do. Our mobile app's core logic is written in Rust with the user interface built with Flutter. This allows us to integrate blockchain logic seamlessly. For data storage, we use a combination of SQLite and a distributed hash table. Because phones have limited storage, data is partitioned with each node holding a subset and retrieving missing data from the peer-to-peer network. So security is, of course, paramount. Secret keys for Conduct, Bitcoin, P2P, and VRF are stored in hardware-backed encrypted storage like Android Keystore and Apple Secure Enclave. Conduct Protocol uses a proof-of-stake mechanism, consensus mechanism, uniquely incorporating Bitcoin tokens in the stake calculation to leverage Bitcoin's work. So this means that a new block is produced on average every 20 seconds. We've even designed the staking mechanism to account for the background processing limitations of mobile devices, aiming for at least 139 active stakers to ensure network stability. We use a UTXO model for the ledger, similar to Bitcoin. Our scripting language allows for complex contracts, and UTXOs can embed labels, JSON data, and even assets, enabling decentralized application data storage and graph-like structures. In short, Conduct Protocol reimagines decentralization by bringing the full blockchain experience to your mobile device, combining robust security with a user-friendly approach, It's a truly mobile-first blockchain solution, and we actually think that it's going to be super important to getting more and more adoption. So thank you for your time, and just visit conductprotocol.xyz. We're about to post our docs, and then we also have a private testnet right now. We're going to open up a public one soon, and we're excited. And then, yeah, I can share with everyone our materials too if you're in the chat.
Coming up. So how do you get the, okay. I wasn't planning on giving a talk, but I taught at Berkeley. I was the first executive resident for the Skydeck. I'm best known for chaos theory and dynamical systems. We helped write the algorithms that helped create Pixar. And so when I give my talk at NVIDIA, this is what this was planned for. I'm going to argue that we added $1 trillion to the valuation of their company because we helped them accelerate the graphics thing, and that's my background. And so NVIDIA asked me to come up with ideas for AI and in the academic world, and I'm going to quickly go through all of them, and I'm going to try to say how they apply to blockchain and AI. Okay, let's see. Okay, so first is the NVIDIA has Earth 2. We're known for hyperlocal search. I once tried to take over search engine InfoSeek. My friends started search engine, and the idea is to get information as tight as possible so we can use blockchain for like parcel tracks and people can own things, and you can mark things, and everybody can have unique properties and things associated with that. Okay, so the next one, pandemics. I'll kind of skip that. We didn't have to have the last pandemic. It was in my book. And I tried to get everybody together, but everybody was in the silo. So going forward, we're going to have to work in the future, and we'll send tags. And environmental things, we can predict tornadoes, but the big thing is if we can help alleviate hurricanes, typhoons and things. So the things, one word, many places. Everybody will have a unique identifier in their soul that they could, and there's encryption that's going to be talked about at DevCon, but you all have unique identifiers and everything associated with that. Health is really interesting. We're doing a lot of work with microbiome. We can potentially cause life to be expanded. We have these top people in Boston. One came here. So Berkeley and we're going to work together, and everybody will have unique identifiers that basically can help you with identification of your microbiome and give you the right stuff to live longer in your gut. So, and public health. And this guy can predict with 94% accuracy whether a couple stay married, and you want to have good relationships, but we can also induce ways that people can interact with privacy. And entertainment, these are the guys that helped create Silicon Valley. There was a guy named Doug Engelbart who invented the mouse, the icon. He was like my dad. And we talked a lot about how we can share information, and through basically through blockchain technology, people will be able to interact at the right levels, and a whole bunch of other things. So I know I've taken enough time. I'm probably the last speaker, but if any of you want to start companies or anything, my email is just berkeley@gmail.com. Thank you, guys.
I don't have slides, actually.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
Unfortunately not, no. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about ZK coins, which is a novel token protocol on top of Bitcoin. It enables efficient scalability, and it provides strong privacy. It has a couple nice features. It scales to roughly 300 transactions per second. As I said, it provides strong privacy on a level of Zcash, like best-in-class privacy. No soft fork is required to enable it on Bitcoin. You can have reusable addresses, which is nice for usability, of course. And it doesn't bloat the UTXO set of Bitcoin at all. And it's actually cheap to verify. So a block full of ZK coins transaction would be vastly cheaper to verify than a block full of regular Bitcoin transactions. And like, how do we enable that magic? Well, the key idea is to use the chain for what the chain is good for, which is an immutable ordering of commitments to prevent double spending. That was a long sentence. What does it mean? Well, it means we don't actually need the blockchain to verify everything about the transaction. The only thing that we really need the blockchain to verify is double spending. That's what we need the blockchain for. That's what we need a global consensus for. Everything else can actually be validated on the client side. And that leads us to the concept of client-side validation. And the key idea behind client-side validation is that if I want to send you a coin, I'm going to send you the entire coin history, all previous transactions. And then you, the recipient, you verify the entire history back to the genesis of that token. And if the entire history was correct, then of course your coin was correct, and then your coin actually carries value. And you can verify essentially everything by just looking at the coin history except for double spending. That's what we need the blockchain for. And of course that's a bit silly, because if I send you the entire coin history and the coin history grows with every transaction, then at some point I have to send you, like, I don't know, gigabytes of data to send you a coin, and that would be quite ridiculous. So what do? Well, as we all know, there's hardly any problem in the life of a cryptographer that you cannot solve with a zero-knowledge proof. So we use ZK snarks to nicely compress the entire history into a succinct proof, and ta-da, we got a nice 200-byte coin proof, and that is as good as sending you the entire history. And no matter how long the coin history is, I just send you that 200 bytes proof, and that convinces you that the entire history of that coin was valid. So the only thing that we don't know, or maybe I should also mention recursive proof, like you can successively extend the proof, like you take the previous proof and then you add another transaction, and then you prove the previous proof, and you prove the transaction, and then you get the next proof, so you don't have to reprove the entire coin history with every transaction. It's quite efficient. However, we haven't talked about double spending. How do we prevent double spending? Well, we need commitments in the chain that prevent double spending. That's what we need global consensus about. So every participant looks at the chain and watches the chain for these commitments, and then they have like an accumulator of all the commitments that were in the chain. And when they receive a coin, they check that the commitment that commits to this particular transaction wasn't in the chain yet, and that proves that no double spending occurred. And these commitments, they are essentially a signature and a public key. But we can apply a couple tricks, and then we can compress them down to roughly 40 bytes. If we also introduce interactivity between multiple senders, then we can compress it down to even 20 bytes. And then we have these so-called publishers in our protocol, which batch commitments into Bitcoin transaction, into published transaction. And these publishers, they are completely permissionless. So everybody can become a publisher. You just need to publish a transaction that matches that particular format. Yeah, that was the bell. OK. So to wrap it up, yeah, ZK-Coins is a payments protocol on top of Bitcoin. The main limitation are UX trade-offs that I haven't mentioned, unfortunately. But it provides efficient scalability and strong privacy. Thanks.
Any more speakers? Otherwise, this concludes the lightning talk session. Thank you all very much, and see you next year.